So welcome again. This is Media Institute of the Caribbean's first session of our Climate Justice series that takes place not just the last week of March, but also the first week of April on Tuesday and Thursday. We have 195 participants from 26 countries. Most of those are in the Caribbean, but we have other countries represented, and we want to say a very special welcome to them. Climate justice is an area that is not just trending, it is one that is impacting us all and in very severe ways. And so we want to thank Open Society Foundations for making this webinar series possible. Mr. Auro Fraser is with us as their representative and as the person responsible for setting the Caribbean agenda for Open Society Foundations. So Auro, on behalf of MIC and everyone here, I wanted to ensure that I say thank you first and foremost. I also want to welcome our speakers and presenters who you will be hearing from this morning. We have Mr. Steve Maximi, Dr. James Fletcher, Mr. Sean Southey, and Mr. Wesley Gibbings. So I want to thank all of you for being part of this effort and for willingly give of your time and your energy to address this issue with us. In our region, I think we have shown that collaboration is very, very important. And through collaboration, discussion, and cooperation, we will get a lot more achieved. Definitely, that is the view of our board members and our advisory board members who are here this morning, including Mr. Marcellus Alexander, who I wanted to make special mention of, who continuously helps the MIC efforts behind the scenes. Marcellus, thank you for that. So without further ado, we are now going to get started with our opening remarks by Mr. Auro Fraser, who is from Guyana. He is one of us, if I could say that safely, Auro. You're one of our Caribbean spirits, and you lead the Open Society Foundation's first ever Caribbean strategy with a focus on climate justice. Auro previously worked on 5 continents with national and international civil society organizations, including the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the International Criminal Courts. And you've seen a lot happening, Auro, and you're now bringing that experience to us in the region. So we're grateful to have you here to give opening remarks. Auro, the spotlight is yours. Thank you.
Good morning to everybody participating today, and thanks so much, Kiran, for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here. I also wanted to recognize the pivotal role that MIC plays in strengthening the ecosystem of the media in the region. You play a very critical role on a whole lot of issues. I'm also thrilled that MIC is taking up the climate justice mantle, given the multiple challenges global warming presents in terms of human rights and democracy, which are also often not understood. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing about the 4 dimensions of climate justice later on. But I wanted to speak briefly about how we conceive climate justice at Open Societies based on the conversations we've been having with Caribbean people right across the region. From our conversations, climate justice and climate injustice, I think it's good to think about climate injustice, operates on 2 levels. The first is international and the second is national and subnational. Firstly, it's clear that those who hold responsibility historically for the emissions causing the climate crisis, industrialized countries, need to assume responsibility for supporting those countries, including the Caribbean ones, that are already on the front lines of climate change's impacts. Caribbean, small island developing states, and other developing countries' voices, including one of the panelists here, James Fletcher, have been at the forefront of pushing for justice by fighting for the 1.5 degree target on climate change, leading the charge for loss and damage, and highlighting the need for more adequate and accessible climate finance for both governments and civil society. The drama of how many industrialized nations continue to seek to resist responding to the existential needs of vulnerable countries must be reported on and revealed. Secondly, is the less understood dimension of climate justice. It affects different groups of people within society differently. and requires solutions that are not just technical, but go right across the social, cultural, environmental, political, and economic dimensions of sustainable development. Climate change acts as a risk multiplier for those most vulnerable, excluded, or discriminated against within our societies. It exacerbates the structural and historical inequities generated by slavery, globalization, and unfair institutional or normative arrangements on international and local levels. Just to illustrate, let me take an example of climate injustice from outside the CARICOM region. There is a non-independent island in the Caribbean belonging to a Latin American neighbor. The island's population is majority Afro-Caribbean, while those governing from the mainland are largely white. The population on the island has long felt abandoned and discriminated against by the mainland, and has resisted having their land and resources taken over by mainland or foreign interests. Such is the frustration of the mainland government with its assertion of rights and people-centered development that they even developed a plan a few years ago aiming to destroy the language, Creole, and culture of the Afro-Caribbean population on the island. When a hurricane hit in recent years, all the infrastructure was destroyed and virtually all the population displaced from the island. While trying to survive in shelters elsewhere, unable to protest or defend their rights, the government began to seek to look at ways to exploit the island's land and resources. According to local actors, the government sought to divide the interests of the population by ensuring that only those whose opinions could be co-opted were taken into account in planning. The government claimed to be rebuilding the island, but little has been achieved so far, despite the passage of time. And what was done left much to be desired in terms of ensuring the resilience and sustainable development visions of the population. A technical review released last month by an expert NGO suggested significant lack of transparency and accountability in the use of public and international funds designated for rebuilding. And as children spent time off their unreconstructed island, they began to lose their relationship with the island, its landscape, and their current cultural heritage. I think you can see where I'm going with this example, and how an extreme weather event can impact on a range of rights, democracy, development, and governance issues. So essentially, for Open Society Foundations working with Caribbean partners, climate justice is about ensuring that climate policy by governments at the local level is developed based on the rights, knowledge, and perspectives of the most vulnerable or affected in society. It is about ensuring that governments are held accountable or recognized when they do well for their ability to build resistance and respond to extreme weather events, as well as slow onset climate change in the political, social, economic, cultural, and environmental arenas. The media is, of course, critical in identifying and telling the stories of how people are building resistance and the multidimensional ways their rights and their ability to participate in decision-making are affected by climate change, and importantly, by government policy. It is essential, therefore, that the media asks difficult questions about what is being done internationally or nationally or locally, and to prepare for and respond to climate change. I look forward to seeing how these upcoming sessions assist all the participants in doing that. And thank you again for listening. And thanks again to MIC.
Thank you very much, Auro. And I hope that this is the start of what your vision and mission is for climate justice in this region. I think it's a good place to start. As I always say to people, media is the bridge. This is how we get the messages out. This is also how we get the feedback from the public to be able to understand in what direction our policies and practices need to go. So thank you, Auro. I now invite Mr. Wesley Gibbings, Vice President and co-founder of Media Institute of the Caribbean, to give his remarks. Wesley also is the founder of the Association of Caribbean Media Workers. He is a member of the steering committee of the Global Forum for Media Development and is a current council member of the International Freedom of Expression Exchange. We are very proud of him. He is an award-winning Trinidadian journalist. I see Trinidad, and I want to think Caribbean because really, Wesley, I think that's what you are. You've covered the region for so many years so effectively. Wesley, I hand over to you to give your opening remarks.
Thanks a lot for that, Kiran. And just to say that Auro's opening remarks cover a lot of what I am about to speak about, because this webinar series explores not one, but two of the most compelling issues of today. Yes, of course, the first has to do with the fact of the climate crisis and what is being attempted to come to terms with it. But the second deals with the ability of journalism to deliver factual news and information on this phenomenon in a manner that positively influences both official and communal behavior. The focus on climate justice falls naturally in the garden of mass media, since it provides valid entry points for the employment of journalism to help join some important dots. From the uneven impacts of climate change to the systemic inequities that accompany needed action to mitigate them. Now, this is not the first time that Caribbean media and journalists have intervened in this manner. The organization which spawned the Media Institute, the ACM, as Kiran mentioned, played a key role in landmark publication of the Climate Change Handbook for Caribbean Journalists back in 2005. And only last year, the ACM launched Covering the Climate Crisis. Then a few weeks ago, the MIC hosted sessions with our Pacific media colleagues to compare notes on these and other matters. Through all this, we can recognize as well stark connections between the current challenges of the pandemic and some of the more difficult issues associated with climate change. The contestation between science and misinformation. The fact that measures to ameliorate negative effects can be painful and offer up challenges of their own. In this instance, variances between the haves and the have-nots, the big and the small. All of this is before us over the next few sessions. Climate justice gets to the heart of some of the real issues of today in ways few other areas of journalistic concern are capable of achieving. So all I can say is, let's get the work done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wesley. So friends, we are going to move into our first session. We have limited time, and I know that the questions are going to be fast and furious. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. James Fletcher, who was the Minister for Public Service, Sustainable Development, Energy, Science and Technology in St. Lucia from 2011 to 2016. In fact, under his leadership, the Caribbean's 1.5 to Stay Alive civil society campaign was developed in 2015. And he helped to educate Caribbean citizens of the importance of the climate change negotiations leading up to COP21. During COP21 in Paris, he was chosen by the COP president to co-chair the discussions on ambition and the long-term temperature goal to achieve consensus on the text of the Paris Agreement. I think it is only right and appropriate that he is our opening speaker, who is going to speak on the topic, how climate change has raised the issues of climate justice. Welcome, Dr. Fletcher.
Thank you very much, Kiran. Good morning, everyone, and it's great to be here. Particularly great to be among friends again. Many I haven't seen in a while. So, and thanks for the opportunity to do something that I enjoy doing, although this subject is a difficult one, and it's one that causes great anxiety for me. But you know, the only way we can get action is by educating and enlisting more soldiers in this battle against climate change. So I'm always happy to be part of a forum that seeks to do that. So today I will speak on just let me get my presentation going, sorry. The climate crisis and the case for climate justice for the Caribbean. And I want to go back to 2015, which is what Kiran just referenced, and the Paris Agreement and the excellent discussions that we had, the negotiations that led to the formation of this historic Paris Agreement on climate change. At the beginning of the negotiations, Chris Mooney, who covered the environmental deaths for the Washington Post, wrote this in the Washington Post: "These countries are the moral center of the climate debate. Will they be left behind?" And Chris had interviewed quite a few people, myself included, on the importance of the negotiations for the Paris Agreement and what we were looking to get out of it. And I think at the front of the minds of many of us was this whole conversation about 1.5 degrees Celsius. All of the work that had been done by our various institutions had shown that 1.5 degrees Celsius was the absolute threshold for small island developing states and climate vulnerable countries. However, up until the Paris Agreement, up until those negotiations at COP21, the discussion was about 2 degrees Celsius. And there was a lot of pushback against our insistence that 1.5 degrees Celsius be that long-term temperature goal, because we understood, even before the rest of the world understood, that not only was 1.5 degrees Celsius the threshold for small island developing states, but really it was the threshold for the world. But at the beginning of the discussions, the negotiations for COP21, nobody except the small island developing states, some of the least developed countries, nobody was talking the language of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's why Chris put this article out in the Washington Post at the beginning. Halfway through the discussions, after the first week, COPs are usually 2 weeks, well, not usually, COPs are 2 weeks in duration. So at the end of the first week, Chris put this new article out in the Washington Post, the radical idea that's gaining momentum at the Paris climate talks. And the radical idea he was speaking about was the possibility that 1.5 degrees Celsius would get into the Paris Agreement, because there seemed to have been a momentum building up, and there was a buzz around Le Bourget, which is where the negotiations were taking place, that these small island developing states and these climate vulnerable countries were insistent that 1.5 degrees Celsius had to be in the long term, had to be in the Paris Agreement, and there were countries, developed countries, that were coming on board. At the end of the Paris Agreement, at the end of COP21, sorry, this is an article that appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald, how a 1.5 degree target overcame the odds at COP21. And if you were part of those discussions, there was almost stunned disbelief, not just among those of us who had been fighting for 1.5 degrees Celsius and were so stunned at the fact that we were able to get that in the text of the Paris Agreement, but many of the developed countries didn't see it coming. I remember the head of the European Commission delegation saying to me, "Fletcher, you guys pulled off a miracle. How did you get 1.5 degrees Celsius in that long-term temperature goal?" Well, in the Paris Agreement, sorry, as a long-term temperature goal. Well, there are many reasons for that. First of all, our SIDS negotiators punched above their weight as usual. And this is a slide that always gave me a lot of pleasure in looking at until last week, when one of the figures in that slide, Dr. Usili, who you see there, passed away suddenly, just after you and I had been on a panel talking about our favorite subject, climate justice. But you was one of our towering negotiators who routinely, together with the rest of the negotiators from small island developing states, have punched above their weight, and when they're grossly outnumbered by the other developed countries' delegations, and they've ensured that they stay up all night and they battle in the trenches to get the types of outcome that really speak to how important climate change and this climate crisis is to us. The Caribbean was also very engaged and influential in the negotiations at all levels. Our ministers of government, some of our heads of government, our CARICOM Secretary General, they were all there, all engaged and giving that very strong united front that was so important. Our artists supported our work. This is Aaron Searle from Jamaica. They were up there with us. Our Caribbean media covered our journey, and that was very important, because I think that 1.5 to Stay Alive civil society campaign played a big role in galvanizing the interest of Caribbean media and Caribbean people on what was going on in Paris, maybe for the first time ever at a conference of the parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Our Caribbean youth were active partners, the Caribbean Youth Environment Network, they were there, and we understood that this was a fight for them, because we were really fighting for a preservation of the quality of life that we enjoyed so that they could enjoy it, and a preservation of a planet that they would inherit from us. And they, I think, particularly the Caribbean Youth Environment Network, understood that and will engage with us right through. President Obama and the USA were engaged and constructive, and I think Obama played a very important role with his round of climate diplomacy with the Chinese Xi Jinping, with Modi of India, and ensuring that there was some momentum going into Paris so that we would have an ambitious agreement. I don't think we've really appreciated the role that Laura Fabius and the COP presidency, the French played in ensuring that we got a positive outcome. They were very sympathetic. I can tell you, for example, telling tales out of school, when I met with Fabius at that meeting, when he invited me to be part of his inner team to work on the text of the Paris Agreement, his inner team of ministers, one of the things that Fabius said there to me, which I've never said to anyone else, is he said to me, I will not let my Caribbean brothers go back without 1.5 degrees in that Paris Agreement. And at that point, I knew that we had a COP president who understood the challenges and how important this was to us as small island developing states. And he was also very sympathetic to our need for loss and damage in that final agreement, because that discussion actually, in addition to him inviting me to be part of his inner cabinet, was also trying to get from me what were the major concerns for small island developing states. And I shared those with him about 1.5 degrees Celsius and loss and damage. Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, was sympathetic to SID's concerns, but very importantly, we use the international media to tell our story to the world. And that's why you as journalists are so important, because you are the medium that can get the story out. You're credible. People listen to you much more than they listen to technocrats and listen to politicians. They trust you. And we understood that. And that's why I made it a point, for example, of speaking with every single international media house, AFP, BBC, Associated Press. Almost every single day, I had a meeting with a member of the press, of the international press, to tell them what was going on and ensure that they kept their eyes on what was happening with us in the Caribbean. We also cultivated strategic alliances through the High Ambition Coalition, which is something that my deceased friend, Tony DeBrun, the Foreign Minister of the Marshall Islands, pioneered, and St. Lucia was very pleased and honored to work together with him on it. So as a group of small island developing states and climate vulnerable countries, we achieved every single target that we set out for in the Paris Agreement: an ambitious binding agreement, recognition of the special circumstances of small island developing states, 1.5 degrees Celsius as a long-term temperature goal, a separate article for loss and damage. Prior to that, they were insisting that loss and damage should be considered as part of adaptation. And we always said, no, loss and damage is about adaptation beyond adaptation. There are certain things that you can't adapt to. If sea level rise is taking up and flooding areas of your coastline and causing you to lose land permanently, then you can't adapt to that. If ocean acidification is causing your marine life to be threatened, your marine ecosystems to be threatened, your coral reefs to bleach and die, your shellfish to die, you can't adapt to these things. And these were things that we felt required a separate treatment through loss and damage that spoke to the irreversible impacts of climate change through slow onset events like ocean acidification and sea level rise, but also the extreme weather events like the Cat 5 hurricanes that we were starting to see with much more frequency. 5-year review cycles, we call for that there will be these 5-year scientific reviews to ensure that the science match the action. Scaled up financial support, which was very important for us, and particularly for our colleagues from Guyana, Belize, and Suriname, provisions for REDD+, which is reducing emissions from deforestation and land degradation. So basically, as I said, what we accomplished in Paris was historic, and COP21 represented an impressive triumph of the multilateral process. 196 parties coming together and agreeing on a landmark historic agreement for climate change to allow the world a platform to deal with this crisis that was descending upon us. Caribbean and other SIDS were among the first to both sign and ratify the Paris Agreement, and this is me at UN headquarters when the Paris Agreement was first opened for signature. St. Lucia was one of the 15 countries that both signed and ratified the Paris Agreement on Earth Day in 2016. Unfortunately, however, 6 years later, time is running out. Greenhouse gas levels are the highest levels ever seen, and that's going back over 800,000 years. Despite the COVID-19 lockdowns, the unprecedented lockdowns, we still have greenhouse gas levels at new records. So it tells you that even this temporary blip, what happened with COVID and shutdown of global commerce, of flights, that made no impact on atmospheric levels of greenhouse gases. And these are the culprits: China, the United States of America, India, the Russian Federation, Germany, the developed countries. And the last 7 years have been the hottest on record since 1880. So every year we're breaking or tying or coming close to breaking a temperature record for our planet. And the last 45 years, since 1976, our planet has not had a colder than average year. Every year since 1976 has been a warmer than average year. And if you look at how that graph is going, it's climbing higher and higher. The climate models are running red hot and the scientists don't know why. So even the desktop simulations are not predicting what we're seeing right now. The temperatures at our poles, particularly the Arctic, are rising much faster than anticipated and much faster than global average. A Siberian town hit its highest temperature over 100 degrees Fahrenheit that was in 2020, I think it was. We don't see 100 degrees Fahrenheit in St. Lucia. That's a rare occurrence. A country a town in the Arctic Circle recorded that in 2020. Polar ice caps are melting and sea levels are rising. And studies are showing again that sea levels are rising faster than expected. Greenland's ice was melting in 2019 at a rate that scientists had predicted would be our worst case scenario in 2070. So we were 50 years ahead of what would be the worst case scenario that had been predicted by our scientists by 2070. Marine ecosystem health is deteriorating, and that's as a result of ocean warming speeding up, because our oceans are being forced to absorb more energy, but also oceans becoming more acidic because the oceans are also being forced to absorb more carbon dioxide. And Chemistry 101, carbon dioxide mixing with water gives you carbonic acid. And it has been found that the Pacific Ocean now is getting so acidic that it's actually dissolving the shells of some of the crabs that are found in that area. So you could understand the implications for marine life when our oceans get acidic and warmer. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the first working group, put out a report last year called the Physical Science Basis. Some of the really collating all of the data, the investigations that they've seen so far. And the results are chilling. In fact, so chilling that the Secretary General of the UN referred to that report as a code red for humanity. Among the highlights or lowlights of that report are that human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years, that each of the last 4 decades has been successively warmer than any decade that preceded it since 1850. And atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations are higher than at any time in at least 2 million years. Let that sink in. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations are higher in our planet than at any time in at least 2 million years. And the other greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide, are higher than at any time in at least 800,000 years. And with every additional increment of global warming, changes in extremes continue to become larger. Then just last month, the second working group of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change put out its report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And again, the findings are equally scary. Climate change has caused substantial damages and increasingly irreversible losses in terrestrial, freshwater, and coastal and open ocean marine ecosystems. That the extent and magnitude of climate change impacts are larger than estimated in previous assessments. And again, this is going back to what I said, the desktop simulations are not even able to predict what we're seeing right now. And that climate and weather extremes are increasingly driving displacement in all regions, with small island developing states like ours in the Caribbean disproportionately affected. And that global warming reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius in the near term would cause unavoidable increases in multiple climate hazards and present multiple risks to ecosystems and humans. And that's because really the climate is a living system. It's a biological system. It's not linear. So when one thing happens in one place, there's a feedback on another system somewhere, and that feeds back on something else. So you have a cascade of events taking place, which makes it very difficult to predict or to simulate by your computer exercises. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're very closely reaching a tipping point with our planet. And for all small island developing states, and this is the town, the village of Denry in my country, and you could see that with all of our countries, our economic and social infrastructure, the jugular of our countries is within a few hundred meters of our coastline. So any impacts will be felt across our countries. We're not like the United States of America or some of the larger countries that, yes, sea level rise will affect Miami and it might affect New York, but some of the interior areas will be spared those impacts. For us, there are no interior areas. Everywhere gets affected by climate change. And some of the things that we will start to see would be more intense hurricanes. And, you know, this is a graphic that shows all the hurricanes that have gone through, or try to show all of the hurricanes that have gone through our region in the last 200 years. And the computer kind of, its processing ability broke down because it just could not process all of these storms. And, you know, the impact of these hurricanes on our countries. Hurricane Ivan caused damage equivalent to 365% of Jamaica's GDP. Dominica, in the space of 3 years, 2015, 2017, 90%, and then 226% of the GDP damage from Tropical Storm Erica and Hurricane Maria. The BVI, Hurricane Irma, over 300% damage, equivalent of over 300% of that country's GDP. And these are some of the pictures that you're very familiar with: Dominica, BVI, and some of our other countries. And all of the studies have shown that climate-related disasters disproportionately impact poorer households. So with our region, with levels of poverty, with levels of vulnerability, we are even more vulnerable and greater impacted by climate-related disasters. And unfortunately, climate-related disasters are more fatal on lower income populations. So basically in our countries, we find ourselves in a continuous cycle of repair and recovery. No sooner than we have repaired some of the damage and started to recover, we get hit by another weather event. It doesn't have to be a hurricane. It could be a drought. It could be flooding. It could be strong winds. We are always recovering from the last weather event, and sometimes recovering from 2 of the last weather events, as in the case of Dominica. So we're seeing longer droughts. We are seeing greater water insecurity in all of our regions, even in countries that you would not think would have a water insecurity problem. We're starting to see that. More heat waves. And with more heat waves come the risk of more deaths from malnutrition, diarrhea, and heat stress. And the WHO has predicted that the direct cost to health from global warming will be between $2 and $4 billion per year by 2030. More forests and bushfires. We're starting to see that right across the world: South America, South Africa, Australia, bushfires, unprecedented bushfires causing damage. And it's not just the infrastructure damage, but it's also an increase in respiratory disease, because you have more particulate matter, and people who are asthmatic are very vulnerable to all of that soot, all of that particulate matter in the atmosphere. An increase in water, sanitation, and hygiene-related diseases and other adverse health impacts as a result of variability in temperature and precipitation. And climate change is also having profound impacts on mental health and well-being. Anybody who has lived through a major hurricane, I can tell you, there's almost a form of PTSD that they suffer every time they think of what they went through. And during the next hurricane season, when they start dreading the possibility of being impacted again. And these are things I don't think we pay sufficient attention to. Greater food insecurity. We have warmer temperatures, less rainfall, and that is having serious impacts on yield and productivity. Inundation of coastal communities, greater loss and damage. And you know, even when you get over 220 medical journals urging emergency action on climate change, you realize that this is a serious problem that we need to wake up to. So really, the threat to small island developing states is existential. So let's fast forward to last year at the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. Now, understanding all of these things that I just said, you would expect that there would have been an urgency in Glasgow at COP26 by the developed world and by all of the parties there to address those problems, particularly after having delayed that COP for 1 year because of COVID, that there would have been great urgency at that COP. Well, what did we find? Let's look at some of the achievements. 1.5 is barely alive. Yes, we came out of COP with the prospect of 1.5 still possible, but a lot less possible given the commitments or lack thereof that we saw at COP26. There was a climate deal reached, but only after China and India pushed back hard to soften language on coal. So up until the last plenary, the climate agreement in Glasgow was supposed to speak about a phasing out of coal. China and India said, absolutely not. The best we can agree to is a phasing down of coal, one of the dirtiest fossil fuels there is. And again, there's a very strong lobby at these COPs where fossil fuel companies are concerned. The world leaders agreed to end deforestation by 2030, but that's a non-binding declaration. So there's nothing binding in that. Sounds good, but there's nothing legally binding in that agreement. There's a commitment to transition to electric vehicles, but the United States, China, Germany, South Korea, and Japan, the world's major vehicle manufacturers, did not sign on to that commitment, neither did Toyota or Volkswagen. There's a US-China declaration that gave some buoyancy to the talks, but when you look at the declaration, it's very short on substance. We finalized the rules for the operation of carbon markets, which is good. So now you could have a trade in carbon, and hopefully that can help some of the developed countries to take the action that they need to. It'll incentivize them, but it's left to be seen how effective that is. But again, true to form, the United States, the European Union, and the rich industrialized nations blocked the establishment of a new fund to provide funding specifically to developing countries for loss and damage. So what they've done really is just kick that can down the road. They've asked countries to come back with tougher targets this year, in Egypt at COP27. And all of the news reports you'll see spoke of there was some progress made, but basically what has happened is that the countries have kicked the can down the road. So with all of that urgency, with that desperate picture I painted before COP26, this is what COP26 delivered for us. We headed for a 2.4 degrees Celsius warming, despite what was said at COP26. And if you look at the predictions that have been done, the 2.4 degrees Celsius is our optimistic end of century scenario. And the work of Professor Michael Taylor and his group at the University of the West Indies Moda campus shows very clearly what a 2.4, 2.5 degrees Celsius warming will mean for the Caribbean. A reduction of between 15 and 25% in precipitation, moderate to severe drought approximately 34% of the time, hot and dry day increases of over 20 days for most of our Caribbean region, not good. So basically, what can we do? What should we do? Well, first of all, I think we have to stop the self-inflicted damage. And I was happy when Auro spoke of the national and the international dimensions of our response, because some of the things that we're doing nationally are worsening, are exacerbating the problem. We have to stop building in high-risk areas. If we know that some areas will be flooded, will be inundated as a result of climate change, why do we continue to put high-density, high-value infrastructure along our coastline with our hotels and these things that we're putting up? We really, that's not sensible development. We have to protect our land-based ecosystems with proper land use plans. Many of our countries don't have proper land use plans. Stop destroying mangroves so that we can put in the next marina or the next water park. These mangroves play very important roles in filtering out sedimentation, providing a buffer for sea level rise, a habitat for marine ecosystem, marine life, sorry. Why are we destroying our mangroves? So that we can put in more infrastructure that we really do not need. Invest in our water sector and make it more resilient. The water sector is one that is particularly vulnerable. Promote climate-smart agriculture, which is a subject I know Steve would be very keen on. Strengthen our public health systems. Build public infrastructure to higher levels of resilience. Our government's doing that. Install early warning systems so that we can identify when a major storm is moving in and evacuate people to ensure that there's minimal loss of life in any of these, with any of these extreme weather events. We know these things are coming. Why are we not taking action domestically? Retrofit our emergency shelters so that people can feel safe in those shelters and that they outfitted with water storage and solar PV panels so that in the event of a disruption to the municipal supply of water or electricity, these emergency shelters can provide some comfort to the people who are in them. Make better use of evidence and data in decision-making. Pay attention, special attention to the most vulnerable groups because they're the ones who are most impacted by climate change. We have to strengthen our insurance, particularly the parametric insurance facility that we have that works very well, but we have to look at that now for our fishers, our farmers, and ensure that national insurance, people understand that we need to have insurance because you will be impacted by a hurricane, you will have to recover from a hurricane. However, and this is the sad part for me, despite the great threat to SIDS, it is business as usual for the industrialized countries. So I'm reaching the end of this presentation to speak of why we need climate justice. There was a promise of $100 billion annually to developing countries from the year 2020 for climate finance to help us deal with the impacts of climate change. We haven't seen anywhere near that money. In fact, we are facing a shortfall of around $75 billion a year from 2020 to 2025. So that $100 billion that was promised to us, we're not seeing anything near it. And again, that is something that has to be addressed. The adaptation costs in developing countries like ours are expected to reach between $140 to $300 billion per year by 2030. And we're not even getting the money now to allow us to deal with our present problems. Since COP21 in Paris, G20 states have subsidized fossil fuels by $3 trillion. So the same countries that agreed to scale down and to move towards a carbon-free economy have invested over $3 trillion in fossil fuel subsidies since 2015. And in their COVID-19 recovery packages, G20 countries have committed $151 billion to fossil fuels. Does that sound like countries that are committed to helping us deal with our existential crisis? I don't think so. The problem is our small island developing states are always referred to as the canaries in the coal mine, the countries that are most vulnerable, but we're always the one to make the compromises, despite being victims of a crisis we did not cause. And how are we victims of a crisis we did not cause? These are the percentages of global greenhouse gas emissions by Caribbean countries. My country, St. Lucia, contributes 0.001%. Even Trinidad and Tobago, which is an oil-producing country, contributes only 0.1% of global greenhouse gases. Yet we're the ones who are facing the brunt of this disaster. And this is from the last Ipcc report, showing that there are multiple climatic and non-climatic risks that are interacting that are worsening the situation for us. So I want to end by saying we have to change our approach. I don't think small island developing states should continue to rely solely on a multilateral system that depends on incrementalism while our lives and livelihoods are being destroyed. I don't think so. The multilateral system is important, but it cannot be the only track that we pursue. We have to intensify the diplomatic pressure on developed countries to curb the emissions of greenhouse gases. Every single interaction we have with these developed countries has to be to tell them that they have to curb the emissions of greenhouse gases. We have to pressure these countries to increase their financial support to climate vulnerable countries. By the time they give us money, the problem that money was supposed to have helped us address has been magnified fivefold. We have to lobby actively and robustly for climate justice. Climate justice has to be part of our vocabulary, part of our narrative in discussing with these people. I'm very happy that Antigua and Barbuda and Tuvalu has formed this Commission of Small Island States that is looking now at ways of using international law to seek redress for climate justice, or as Auro referred to it, climate injustice. Last year in October, the UN Human Rights Council took a great step forward in saying that every human being has a right to a healthy environment and a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. We need to use that now as our anchor in addressing this problem legally, because not tackling climate change adequately is a death sentence for cities. And there are travel magazines now that are putting out bucket lists of islands to visit before they disappear. That's unconscionable. These are countries, these are lives, these are heritages. This is a history that is disappearing because of the callous disregard of developed countries to our plight. And I think, we have to amplify and escalate this discussion now. But we also have to ensure that our governments do not worsen our plight by pursuing unsustainable and irresponsible development agendas. And that's where you, our Caribbean regional media, have such an important role to play. We need you to join this fight. We need you to help to amplify that voice. Yes, we know that there are other things that you have to report on, but I think none of these things exceeds the urgency of climate change. So I'm not telling you stop reporting on the things that you're reporting on, but please elevate climate justice, climate injustice to the top of your totem pole of the things that you make a priority when you're reporting. We have to increase public awareness and education on climate change and the need for climate justice. And I'm really happy about this webinar, which I think is doing just that. Last year, the organization that I formed, the Caribbean Climate Justice Project, did just that by bringing together 15 dynamic young people from across the Caribbean to debate this issue of climate justice. And they put out a landmark resolution that, if you haven't seen, I'd be quite willing to share with you through the Media Institute for the Caribbean on what needs to happen to protect their future, the future of the young people of the Caribbean. We have to make sustainable development and climate change issues that matter politically. Right now, they do not. We have to make that happen, and you are so important in making that happen. We have to hold the multinational corporations in developed countries to account for their actions and their inactions. So my plea to you is, please get engaged, immerse yourself in this, interact. We need you as part of this battle. The climate is changing. We have to change. We have to change the way we operate. We have to change the way we do things. And these three paintings by a St. Lucian painter, Jonathan Gladding, that we basically use as our posters at these COPs, I think show you how desperate the situation is. This one Jonathan did for COP21. This one I think he did 2 years later. And this is the most recent one that he did last year for COP26. That is really us in the Caribbean. The climate crisis is an existential threat to us in the Caribbean. And I want to leave you with the words of Albert Camus, the Nobel laureate, who, and this is how I feel about this. You know, each generation feels called upon to reform the world, but mine knows that it will not reform it. Its task is perhaps even greater. It consists in preventing the world from destroying itself. That's the point we're at right now. So we have a choice to make. Do we push the world towards a sustainable future, or do we continue going relentlessly towards a breakdown in our climate and a change in the lives of us as we know it? For more information, I'd encourage you to visit the Caribbean Climate Justice Project, our website, caribbeanclimatejustice.org. This is excellent work that we've started with great support from Auro and his team at Open Society Foundations, and we're looking to continue over the next 2 or 3 years. And we really would like to have the Media Institute of the Caribbean, all of the journalists in our region, all of civil society on board with us as we take this outside of government and we put pressure to cause the changes that need to take place. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very, very much for that, Jimmy. You know, very enlightening, and it covers so much ground. I didn't see any questions come up in the chat, but I have a quick one that you can perhaps use the remaining 2 minutes to address, which is that you are proposing some alternative strategies outside of the current multilateralism, and you lobby very strongly for more advocacy and the role of a whole of society approach. But what are the specifics of that? Because that sounds really noble, and I think it can work. But if you drill that down, what would be some of the key elements of that kind of strategy?
I think first of all, Wesley, the first part has to be, and I don't think we can't run ahead of ourselves. We have to make people understand that this is something that everybody needs to be invested in. So education is the first part of that strategy, because we run the risk of trying to do something and the rest of the region saying, but hold on, this is not a big issue for us. Auro told me that he was on a panel recently where some people were saying that they didn't see the importance of climate justice and all this talk about reparations for climate justice. What are we talking about? That we have to stop looking backwards. So I think the first part of that strategy has to be education and educating as many people as possible. Having done that, and it's not that this should be done sequentially, I think it has to be done concurrently. Whilst we're doing the education, we now have to look at what are the avenues where we can take some of these. First of all, we have to hold our governments accountable. So where we can push for judicial review of some of the decisions that they're taking that are putting us in a difficult position, that are making the impacts of climate change worse, then I think we have to pursue that. Now, unfortunately, there is not yet that forum, that medium in the region that will allow civil society or a group of civil society people to cause judicial review of a government decision. And that's one of the things that I'm hopefully trying to work through with Auro to see how we can cause that environment to take place so we can hold our own governments accountable. Because someone once said to me, climate change is everything, but everything is not climate change. Some of the things we're doing are worsening the impacts of climate change. So that's one. Then we have to look at where can we anchor some of those legal interventions. So for example, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, can we use that to challenge some of the things that are happening that are causing us to lose some of our sovereignty? When you are losing your land mass, your land space as a result of sea level rise. And the good thing now is there's a branch of science called attribution science that's allowing scientists to very clearly attribute how much of a natural disaster has been caused by climate change. So Hurricane Maria in Dominica, yes, Hurricane Maria would have taken place, but climate change worsened the impacts of Hurricane Maria. I'm not saying this is what it is, but attribution science allows us to ensure that, allows us to identify how much of that impact was due to climate change. So we can now say, this is what you've caused, so this is what we need you to address. So I think United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, this landmark resolution that was passed at the UN Human Rights Council that's saying that everybody has a right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. It means, again, we have an anchor. Some of our constitutions actually give, I think the Constitution of Jamaica, for example, it says that every citizen of Jamaica has the right to a healthy environment. We need to get the rest of our region to embrace that, so that we can now see how we can cause a new set of jurisprudence to develop around climate justice. It's a new field. There will be pushback. I mean, we're getting pushback from developed countries for a funding mechanism. They don't even want to hear any talk of liability and compensation. So it's not an easy battle. But I don't think we should continue looking at just the multilateral process, because it is moving too slowly. And unfortunately, climate change, this climate crisis, is unfolding much more rapidly than the pace in the multilateral negotiating process. So we have to see what else we can do to escalate this discussion and escalate action that will prevent our lives and livelihoods being put in further peril than they are right now.
Thank you very much for that, Jimmy. Quite a lot of food for thought. I myself spent some time looking at the application of international law on some of these things, enough to understand that it's a highly problematic area. And I know that other presenters will want to pick that up as we go along. So I want to thank you once again on behalf of all of us who are in on this call, and hand over now to Kiran to proceed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fletcher and Wesley. And just to remind everyone that you can still send your questions in the chat, because we will send them along to our presenters and we will get those responses to you. Lisa, I know you asked something, but Wesley is going to be addressing that shortly. We move into our next session now with Steve Maximi. Steve is an EU-recognized expert on climate change and was a member of the team that wrote the first risk management manual for climate change in the Caribbean. He is science advisor to ACM and by extension now to MIC, and he has worked in every CARICOM country. He is an advocate for just transitions. So it is only fitting that he is going to present right now on just transitions and how we examine the 4 interpretations of climate justice. Steve?
Thank you very much, Kiran. Good morning, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to be presenting at this time. I have to do some conscience clearing. Full disclosure, this is not going to be a presentation from an uninterested bystander. I am extremely biased. My focus is going to be on SIDS, on the Global South. I am going to be presenting perspectives that have been honed, not from some article that I may have read or someone that I may have spoken to, but because I'm part of the front line. I am a combatant in this fight. I am not approaching it with this balanced perspective that you hear so much about. I recognize that being on the front line means that your perspective is a lot different. So with that proviso, I shall proceed to share my screen. I'm going to attempt to run through my slides fairly quickly so that we have some time for the discussion subsequently. So, are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we are, Steve.
Oh, great.
Yes.
So I've been asked to speak about just transition and the 4 interpretations of climate justice. And I heard Auro remarking, about, his willingness to wait to see what I'm going to concoct in terms of 4 interpretations of climate justice. But this term just transition was originally associated with the US labor movement in the 1970s. And it broadened as labor forged alliances with environmental justice groups in the 1990s. And it emerged in response to increased regulation of industries that were deemed to be heavy polluters. But before we get into this, I think it's only fair that we have some definitions. So a transition is a process or period of changing from one state or condition to another. And that is fairly straightforward. Where the fun begins is when we start talking about just. When you hear people talk about a just transition, we are normally assuming that they're using just as an adjective, and it is based on or behaving according to what is morally right and fair, in other words, righteous. It is being what is merited, in other words, you're getting what you just deserve, what you deserve, and it's legally correct or lawful. But there's also another interpretation of just, just can also be an adverb, where it's only and simply. And there are times when we are being told in this part of the world to just transition. I mean, just transition, why all this fuss? It's not such a big thing. Just transition, stop being a crybaby. And you heard Jimmy, expound on all the different ways in which the global north has been telling us that. But CARICOM is no stranger to transitions, especially some of these decidedly unjust ones. We have had to do political transitions from colonialism to independence. We have had to do economic transitions from plantations to private farms to industrialization by invitation. We have had to do some industrial transitions as well, from goods to services. There was a time when this region was manufacturing or assembling goods. Now we're more or less consigned to doing services, especially those connected with tourism. There was also a failure to make intellectual property, and this is an area that I'm particularly passionate about, transition from seeing intellectual property as a legal imposition as opposed to an economic imperative. And if we have time, I'd like to spend some time on that later on in terms of what do I mean by that and how our lack of appreciation for intellectual property has stymied us in our efforts to just transition. Well, when it comes to climate change occasioned transitions, then this just transition is with respect to climate change implies that all those citizens disadvantaged by adaptation and mitigation action will be buffered through socioeconomic programs that protect livelihoods. I mean, it's really a task to come after Jimmy, but I think you all got a good explanation of what is involved. So this just transition is supposed to be fostering healthy, renewable economies, and in which we are going to be moving away from fossil fuel dependence and extractive industries. And there's this idea that the just aspect of transition is steeped in moral underpinnings of self-determination with respect to communities or countries. In other words, if it's going to be just, it has to be lawful, of course, and it should be self-imposed. We should be deciding on how we are going to transition. And this is going to be very, 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 very important when we start getting into some of the nitty-gritty of these climate justice issues. So I just want to repeat that this just aspect of the transition is steeped in moral underpinnings of self-determination with respect to the communities or countries involved. When we say just transition, it has none of the compulsory overtones associated with just do it, the Nike type response. Just do it. I mean, why are you all in the Caribbean always complaining? So what's the difference between 1.5 and 2 anyway? The idea is not to compel anyone to just transition and quit complaining. So that if we are to conceptualize, live, and breathe this idea of a just, where just is an adjective, transition, then we really have to approach it differently. There's an appreciation of the fact that the changes advocated in the quest for less carbon emissions are for the benefit of humankind. So this is where all the things that Jimmy mentioned and Auro hinted at, where we are now at the intersect of law, governance, civil society, advocacy, and the science. This is what is going to help us negotiate whatever this just transition is going to turn out to be. When you think about a tourism-dependent region like the Caribbean, an industry whose carbon footprint includes airline and maritime travel, ground transportation, food miles, which is something that we spend a little bit of time on, I hope. When you talk about air conditioning needs, and you saw what the projections are from Professor Taylor and the Climate Studies Group, potable water use. And here again, I don't think anybody should mention water at this time without, at least making some sort of reference to the contribution of Dr. Seeley. Golf course irrigation. All the powered equipment that you need for the appliances and lighting and so that are associated with this tourism product, which the region has has literally had its fill. So how do you just transition in an area that is dominated by a service industry and one in which you are on the front line as well? So what are some of the transitions that have been implied or implicated or tried to activate within the region? So we have had an amalgam of these planned mitigation, as in the NDC, the nationally determined contributions. And we have had, and I'm not speaking out of school in this sense, we have had some forced adaptation-driven, very reactive policies and practices, which I am open to challenge on that, from anybody in the audience. Since agricultural production will continue to be negatively impacted by climate change, and it's going to lead to these forced adaptation-driven transitions. These transitions need to be just, adjective now, because the nutrition security of these nations will be significantly compromised. And again, no apologies for those statements. What have been the types and approaches to climate justice? And as I said, I'm running through this so that we have more time for us to have a conversation, because I am one of the believers in the DCOW continuum, where you go from data, information, knowledge, understanding, wisdom, and just throwing information at you by way of several, however well-appointed slides is not enough. For us to make that transition to knowledge, we must interrogate the information. So that's why I'm throwing it at you this quickly, so that we have more time to actually interrogate it. So when you talk about climate justice, and we've had definitions of climate justice before, so I won't go into that. But in terms of the interpretations, there's a distributive interpretation in terms of determining who gets what. And I'm going to be talking about something called CSAC when we get to that. Then there's a procedural type of climate justice. We are determining how fairly people are treated, and we're going to talk about a little more about just transitions when we get there. And then there's a retributive, which is based on punishment for wrongdoing, carbon taxation, we caught you, we know you're responsible, and this is how we're going to punish you. And there's the restorative, which is the one that I find most interesting, which tries to restore relationships to rightness. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the GCF funding and so for adaptation. And I think Jimmy did a really good job of hinting at what I'm going to be stressing, that this adaptation talk is in and of itself not enough. So let's get to distributive climate justice. Now, how are these alleged adaptive and mitigative resources being allocated? How do you limit greenwashing? And as I said, without getting into a separate conversation about greenwashing, I think most of you will know that there are some activities, projects, processes that appear green, but it's really greenwashing, and that, people are operating, it's business as usual, but just with a green cover. And to show that I'm not just a bystander in this fight, I actually have a horse in the race. I have a commitment to addressing some of these things that I see as ills. So that one of the areas that I'm particularly strong on, and that is what Jimmy referenced when he said, I'm sure Steve will want to say something about this, is that we have been asked to develop climate smart agriculture. And over the years, unfortunately, we have had a series of these unidimensional projects claiming to be climate smart agriculture that have been cumulative at best, that have not been transformational. And I am now in a position to say publicly that one of the leading international organizations dealing with agriculture have commissioned UE, and me by extension, to look at some of these projects over the years that were really not transformative, and to come up with projects that are truly transformative. And it is in this sense that I am, again, saying that CSAC, which is a smart agriculture compliant prioritizing mechanism, is one of the ways in which you limit greenwashing. So without delving too much into that at this stage, I will go on to talk about some of the procedural climate justice type of issues. And this is determining how fairly people are treated. And I think Jimmy was there, but in Poland and Katowice with COP24, the whole idea of just transition, how do you, I mean, granted that I'm biased and that I have a SIDS and global South focus, but how do you tell people in the global North that you're to just transition from coal? What do you do in winter? You know, as the popular maxim goes, I mean, while the grass is growing and the horse is going to be starving, you know, what do people do in the interim? How do you tell people to just shut down all of their coal operations? And how do you then deal with the COLD operations in winter? And one of the most startling things surrounding procedural climate justice type discussions is this business about net zero and not zero. Let's remember that net zero is not about getting to a state where there are no more emissions from fossil fuels. What they have agreed, what the IPCC has agreed to, and what the UNFCCC has agreed to, is that there will be a point where there will be net zero, in the sense that the emissions emitted are going to be balanced, counterbalanced by the absorptive capacity of your sequestration methods or whatever mechanisms are in place. So that there have been suggestions that this net zero in 2050 is going to be probably comprised of 80% renewable energy use and 20% fossil fuels. The real fun starts, and this is a question that, you know, that the Guyanas and Trinidad and Suriname and SIDS have to play with, is that who is going to be allowed to produce that 20% come 2050, 2051, 2052? How just is that transition going to be? How can you deny a starving horse by telling them to, you know, continue starving, you know, because we have grass coming? So that is going to be a really, really interesting conversation as we proceed for the next 4 days, but I thought I'd want to just flag it. Then there's retributive climate justice. I know this is the one that I suppose most of us are most familiar with. It's based on punishment for wrongdoing, you know, the polluter pays principle. You know, a lot of local legislation is based on that. You know, there's carbon taxes, because there's this concept of atmospheric commons. In other words, if I pollute here in Grenada, where I happen to be now, where we're living, you know, I'm really polluting atmospheric commons. I mean, that pollution is not going to just hover over Montgelou or St. George's or wherever I happen to be today. It is going to be common. So there's such a concept as atmospheric commons, so that if I pollute here, people are going to feel the impact in the Pacific, right? Where people living on atolls are going to see their entire life and island disappear. So then that is where carbon taxes come in. But as with all justice type systems, in the same vein that you have carbon taxes, there are also carbon credits that have been developed, so that polluters, and this, we have to be blunt, polluters in the North can offset their pollution by utilizing carbon credits from this part of the world. And don't get me wrong, and I'm not totally averse to the system, and I'm just saying that it is a stopgap. It's not a solution. And then there's restorative climate justice. Again, as I said, it's really difficult to follow Jimmy. Jimmy hinted at this. And this is where you're looking to restore relationships to rightness. In other words, some GCF, this is a Green Climate Fund, by the way. Some GCF grant funding is focused on this aspect. So narrowly define resilience, you know, into something that is primarily adaptive. And I am on record, and I'm very, very pleased to announce this, you know, and to show off literally about this, is that I, in public, had Professor Michael Taylor, who is a regional guru, and a member of, you know, a number of IPCC editorial committees, agree with me that this IPCC definition of resilience is not applicable for us here in the region. And it has to do with, and this is the official IPCC definition of resilience. I mean, we all can read, of course. I'm not going to be reading it out to you. But what we agreed on in principle was that here, this talk about resilience had better have some mitigative components to it. Here's why. If we fail to involve mitigation, and if, as again, following on from what Jimmy said, if you are going to restore me to some position that I was in before, I'm not too sure how just that is. Because if you're just going to restore me to what the business as usual scenario was before, then if, as was mentioned earlier, if I just lost, 8 or 10% of my landmass, my limited landmass, why would you want to restore me to that level? And we're talking about a different level of compensation now. So that would be my take on why this narrow definition of resilience is not applicable to us in the region. As I said, I hope I did a good job of rushing through some of those, fairly headline topics so that we have more time to interrogate whatever information I was able to share with you. And you get to look me in the face and see my response to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Steve. Steve, I just want to jump into it because I saw Sayini had a question. So let me just pull that up. She says, if possible, it would be interesting to hear you censor the IP issue in hampering Caribbean's just transitions. Is it a discussion that is ongoing that you're aware of?
Well, the idea is that, as I said, being a combatant in this intersect, I was lucky enough to be on the cabinet appointed committee that wrote the intellectual property policy for Trinidad and Tobago. And I completed their first intellectual property strategy, national strategy. So I'm coming from this from the perspective of somebody who knows a little bit about intellectual property. We have been subject, and this is all part of the whole justice and restoration bit, to a lot of, let's take a simple case, bioprospecting. We have had people come to this part of the world, take our germplasm or plant material, let's say, head up north, go into a laboratory, and then produce something that they now own, that they have trademark, licensed, gotten geographical indications for, what have you. Let me just give you a quick analogy. It is similar to someone coming to the region with a handheld tape recorder. Tape something from Beckett, my age is going to show now in terms of the examples I'm using, but tape something from Beckett, tape something from Calypsonian Beckett for the people outside the region, tape something from Sparrow, tape something from Aleutian Calypsonian, like Haggai, let's say. Take those compilations, go up to the US, and now print a record and say that they own the copyright for it. It's a similar type of analogy, because we have always seen intellectual property here as a legal imposition. When you talk intellectual property, when I was doing the research for the strategy, every organization I went to, they said, oh, we need to talk to our lawyers. With all due respect to lawyers, lawyers have nothing to do with intellectual property. They have to do with the protection of the rights, right? Intellectual property rights. But the actual intellectual property is about creators. It's about creators, people who are creating the works of art or whatever it is that is the outcome of human processes. So I'm saying that because we have not licensed, copyrighted, trademarked, listed as trade secrets, our transitional methods, we have now found ourselves at a loss that we're actually buying some of our own stuff back, I mean, to put it bluntly. And because I'm not just talking about this, that is why that CSAC thing that they developed is a trademark, SIDS-based approach. That is how I'm putting my money where my mouth is, literally. So sorry for the extended answer, but
No, thanks for that, Steve. Steve, in looking at how we do our coverage as journalists in getting the public to understand this issue, what strikes you as areas we are lacking in? What do you think we need to do better as journalists in this whole just transition discussion?
I'm not sure that it is what we can do better as journalists. What we can do in this all of society approach, and I've heard that term used about twice for the day already, is an all of society approach. I have tried to approach it from the science point of view as science advisor to the ACM and lately to the MIC. I'm still awaiting my contractual arrangements, right? As science advisor to the MIC, to let you know that there's a need for interpretation, right? Science literacy isn't all that it should be, and it's all that it could be. And so you need scientists who are able to make that bridge, who are communicators, and I fancy myself as one of those, right? Whatever minuscule way. So you need more input from the science end. You need more input from the advocacy and the civil society end. And in that respect, I've also been in the front lines because I was recently lucky enough to write the 14 core courses for a new associate degree here in Grenada, which is an associate degree in sustainable community development practice for civil society organizations. And it is heavily based, because of my own internal bias, on the climate crisis. So some of my students, a couple of whom are actually on the chat, would know that I keep stressing, how do we get civil society involved in the climate crisis? How do we get green events planning and that type of thing? So those would be some of the approaches. So I don't see it as a responsibility of the journalists per se. I think they have to operate in an ecosystem, without mincing words, where the information is freely available, but that transition to knowledge comes by way of sessions like these, where you have the scientists, the former politicians, the former PSs and so, and the media experts, the Wesleys, right? And soon to come, the Sean Sotheby's, the people, all the people who are involved at approaching this thing from the different intersects. Because as I said, this climate justice issue requires an all of government, all of society approach. I do not think it is fair to be using just in the sense of the adjective. I don't think it is fair that the journalists bear the brunt of the responsibility of investigating and finding out, without that supportive ecosystem. So again, sorry for being so long-winded, but
a stronger collaboration basically is what you're saying is one of the key ways for us to do this. And I agree with that. There has to be strength in numbers, is something I said earlier. So let's go to something Wesley asked, which is what was going to actually be one of my questions. And then I'll go to a comment that Amy Can made. Wesley says that both you and Dr. Fletcher appear to suggest that the Ipcc rulemaking is skewed to favor the big and wealthy countries. Can either of you respond on this interpretation of what you have said?
Well, given my declared bias, I'm going to preempt Jimmy by saying, yeah, but sorry, Jimmy, go ahead, please.
I wouldn't say so for the Ipcc rulemaking. I think the problem lies with the UNFCCC process. The Ipcc, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the reports that they put out, I believe, have been very objective, and they basically show an accumulation of the science that is existing on climate change. And very often, some of the things that have been put out in the Ipcc report, I think, are very uncomfortable and awkward for the developed countries to read. And this last Ipcc, the work of the report of the second working group, I know there was a lot of pushback, for example, on the whole question of loss and damage, and they didn't want to see loss and damage. Many of the developed countries did not want to see loss and damage, or as they put it, losses and damages reflected in that report. So I don't think the problem is with the Ipcc, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I think the problem is with the UNFCCC process that is very slow. And it's because it's a multilateral process. You have 196 parties that are trying to agree on a subject that, yes, is a critical one for all of us, but they believe that the response, our reaction to that crisis, cannot be one that plunges some of them into crisis. So you'll hear the Saudi Arabian countries, for example, speak of response measures. Yes, okay, you do these things, but what are you going to do to help me to cushion the loss of economic activity that will take place in Saudi Arabia and some of the oil-producing countries like Kuwait. When we were trying to get consensus on 1.5 degrees Celsius as a long-term temperature goal, I co-facilitated the discussions with Tina Sundtoft, the Minister of the Environment of Norway. And in the several bilaterals that we held, there were two meetings that stuck with me. One was the meeting that we had with the Arabian countries, where the head of delegation for Saudi Arabia came up to me and very, very aggressively said to me, "You small island people will get 1.5 degrees Celsius over my dead body." And that was how we felt about it. I'm happy to say we got 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the last time I attended the COP, he was still alive. So, we got both things. But the representative from Argentina came up to me and he said, "Look, I'm really sympathetic to your plight. I understand what you're saying. But you have to understand that for my country, Argentina is a major livestock producing country. Our economy depends on cattle production. So for us to get 1.5 degrees Celsius requires drastic reductions in methane production. So that will have implications for our economy because our economy is based on livestock. So yes, we would like to work with you, but it's how can we work with you so that you don't imperil our own economy?" And among our grouping, the G77 plus China, that we operate as one group and negotiate as one massive bloc, you have countries like China and India, which, as you saw in COP26 in Glasgow, were pushing back on any firm declaration on phasing out coal. So even the countries that are developing, and you believe that, okay, they are theoretically supposed to be on your side, you get pushback from them on certain things. And that's why I'm saying it is challenging enough to get consensus at a COP, because there's a lot of splitting hairs on text and wording. COP21 almost completely unraveled on the final day, the final plenary, when we were coming to that COP for Lower Fabius to gavel the agreement on one word: should and shall. The agreement, the first text we had spoke of should. Apparently, and this is what was said, when the final text came out, it said shall. John Kerry was adamant the United States will not sign any agreement that says shall, because that has a legal implication and he will not be able to get that past his Congress. So the United States will not sign this agreement, and we need now to either change the text or reopen negotiations. We were dismayed because we knew if we reopen negotiations at that stage, the whole Paris Agreement will unravel. The French very cleverly said that, okay, it was an error in translation. It really was supposed to have been should, but in translating it from French to English, it became shall, so we went back to should. But that's the kind of gymnastics, legal and linguistic gymnastics you have to play in the UNFCCC process. It's expected, but, and yes, the bigger countries are the ones that very often dictate the pace at which things go, because they can veto whatever you're putting forward. So I think the problem is that the slowness of the UNFCCC process, not the Ipcc. The Ipcc, I think, is a very rigorous scientific process, and I would not want to say that it is flawed. I think the UNFCCC process is too slow right now.
So Dr. Fletcher, let me just pick up this point. It was posted by Amy Can in the chat based on what you're saying, right? She says that it appears that we, and I want to take we in the context of SIDS maybe, that we are just the weak players in a game that was designed through the systematic injustices to lose. Do you agree or disagree?
I don't think we're the weak players. As I said in one of the earliest slides I put up, I think we are formidably strong players. When you look at our size, when you look at our economic influence, and when you look at what we've been able to achieve, it's remarkable. We go into a COP. St. Lucia goes into a COP with a delegation of 3 people. When you look at the totality of the Caribbean delegation at a COP, we're probably looking at 50 people. When you put all the islands together, some islands will go there with a little bit, with a few more people. The US delegation is probably 50. The US delegation, the US come with people who specialize in finance, specialize in science, specialize in mitigation, specialize every single area. They have more than one person who is specialized in it. When our delegations are negotiating, they do round the clock. So for example, in Warsaw, the COP in Warsaw, when we came up with the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, our delegates stayed at that hall in Warsaw for 36 hours straight. They never went home, never showered, never slept. The US is able to, and not just the US, the EU, Australia, the developed countries are able to cycle their delegations, they're able to get support. When you're at a COP in wherever it is, the totality of your climate change brain trust is at that COP. The US, however, have many people back home in capital who they can run things by. Look, give us a legal interpretation of this. So I think given our size, given the resources at our disposal, I think we cut a very formidable team as small island developing states. But the problem is we are outnumbered. And given the fact that we are outnumbered, I think it's remarkable what we've been able to achieve, because this is stacked against us. The whole negotiating process is stacked against us. And that's why civil society is so important. Because in Le Bourget at COP21, there was a time in that hall in the Blue Zone when civil society led by Greenpeace came together and took over that hall. And they were shouting for 1.5 to stay alive, loss and damage. And that changed the whole temperature, the whole complexion of that COP. So as a group of delegates, we could not do that. But with civil society behind us, not just in the COP, but at home, that's where the strength lies. And that's where you, our Media Institute, our journalists, you are so important, because you help us to amplify our voices and you help us to reach your colleagues in other countries. We have people in civil society in the developed world who are very sympathetic to our cause. Look at what Greta Thunberg is doing out of Sweden. And I keep telling our Caribbean youth that while I'm very appreciative of what Greta is doing, I want to see Caribbean young people doing that, because Greta is not at the front end of climate change. People like Dizan Billy from Trinidad and Tobago and Jamila Sealy of Barbados, or Snadia Mahal, or some of the young people I worked with like Boykin Smith and Christiane Zakour. And these young people are the ones who are at the front line of the climate change. They should be at the front line of the climate change discussions. I want to see them, not Greta, because I think they have a much more compelling story to tell. So we have to bring them along with us, and the private sector has to help them, because the private sector is what is making it possible for Greta to do what she's doing in Sweden. Caribbean private sector needs to make it possible for our journalists and our civil society to increase their advocacy in the Caribbean.
Thank you for that, Dr. Fletcher. I want to go to Steve. Steve, we have a question about data. Do you feel that there is enough available data, scientific data from our region to help state our case?
Oh, most definitely. Most definitely. I can jump at that one. As I said, as someone lucky enough to have had, peripheral and some more intimate dealings with the MONA Climate Studies Group, as just one example. I mean, when you think of the type of work that has come out of their modeling and remodeling capacities, I don't think the data is the issue. But again, I'm concerned about that continuum. It's all good and well to have so much data floating around, even so much information floating around, until the participants, the people involved, are knowledgeable, until they have interrogated that information. I don't think it is going to be sufficient. And just as one closing word, please. The idea of us punching above our weight has to do with the formidable work of OASIS over the years, which is the organization of small island states, and contributions like people from like the days of Dr. Decima Williams and so. And Wesley and I are living proof of the fact that when the Caribbean gets involved with an international action, as we did at COP17 in Durban, where agriculture was going to be placed on the front burner, and we had help from FANRAPAN and some of the other networks that exist outside of the Caribbean. So I just thought I would sneak that in. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Steve. And I just want to agree with what Dr. Fletcher have, and to acknowledge the fact that some of the young people he spoke of are actually here with us. And I agree wholeheartedly with that statement that, we really need to ensure that our young people, their perspectives and voices also be heard. And it's so important for the media to help reflect that, and also reflect the advocacy work by our civil society groups. So I want to thank you all for your questions, and to Steve and to Dr. Fletcher for entertaining the questions that we had and for the lively discussion. We now move into our next session for this morning with Mr. Wesley Gibbings, and Wesley is going to chat with us about reporting on climate change, the Caribbean perspective. Wesley?
Thanks a lot for the introduction, Kiran, and it's very difficult coming after Steve and Jimmy, because they cover this thing in a way that's very difficult for somebody coming from the other end of the spectrum, which is coming from the outside, gathering and then taking back outside with me. So it's very difficult, but we have to do it. And the fact of the matter is that as Caribbean media, we have been doing it. Because as I said in the opening statement, you know, Caribbean media and journalists are not new to this whole discussion of climate change and the climate crisis. Some evidence that this is so can be found in our work on the very first climate change handbook for Caribbean journalists, which was put together in 2005 in collaboration with what was then the mainstreaming adaptation to climate change project of CARICOM. That was back in 2005. Dr. Neville Trotz was at the 5Cs, was at MAC at the time, and he very much led that process on the scientific side. Then more recently, and I served as editor for that particular publication. Then in 2021, the ACM in collaboration with UNESCO put together Reporting the Climate Crisis, a handbook for Caribbean journalists. And both documents are downloadable from the ACM's website, acmpress.org, if you're interested in taking a look. So in a sense, we are not new to this whole process. We have been there, we have been present. There are journalists who have traveled and covered the COP processes. But clearly, we need to do much more than that. And I'll come to more, what is the more I'm speaking about. But let's get our bearings right. What are we speaking about? What's the geographical context? And I'm addressing this presentation principally to the journalists, but there are others involved who would have an interest. What's the geographical context? Small island states and low-lying coastal regions. So all of the countries of CARICOM are there, plus some of the other countries that are washed by the Caribbean Sea, as the ACS definition goes for the Caribbean. We need to be clear about that, because in forging alliances and identifying common concerns, what you'll find is that across borders, we share a lot of common concerns, and we need to be part of this common front against what are formidable forces at play in terms of this whole matter of addressing climate change or the climate crisis, and the mechanisms to move us from one point to the other. And I think Steve expressed very well the inequities involved in that process. So that's the geographical context. As journalists, we sometimes also forget that there are other contexts that we need to bear in mind. By and large, here in the Caribbean, the SIDS and low-lying coastal region are plagued by limited natural resources. We are not very wealthy countries by and large. Some are becoming more wealthy now, but by and large, we have limited natural resources that are available to move us from one point of development to the next. We have generally high population densities, whatever the population distributions. In a general sense, we have high population densities where people tend to settle and to reside and work, areas that are centered in very specific locales. And that comes with various challenges. High susceptibility to natural hazards. We know the story. Every year the hurricane season comes, and there are some from among us who have to pick up the pieces and start basically virtually from zero. So we are highly susceptible to natural hazards, and if we thought that hurricanes were all, then we have the hazards that we confront with respect to the earthquakes, volcanoes, and others. Low economic resilience. Throughout the pandemic period, if it was one thing that was exposed, is the fact that most of our economies are absolutely vulnerable at the slightest misstep in terms of public life and what's happening globally. So there's low economic resilience. Poor infrastructure in vulnerable areas. Both Steve and Jimmy spoke about the fact that among the measures that we need to take is to pay attention to development in vulnerable areas. We continue building, erecting structures in low-lying coastal areas that are becoming increasingly vulnerable to sea level rise and other phenomena. We have underdeveloped support systems in the insurance and financial sectors. I remember back in 2006, 2007, we were doing, under the banner of the Caribbean Environmental Reporters Network, we were doing a series that looked at the climate change risks to different sectors within the Caribbean. And I had among my assignments was to look at how the insurance sector was responding to the climate change threat. Unfortunately, when I went to the people, the main players in the sector, most of them were pretty much clueless about what we were about to face, what we are facing. By comparison, Lloyd's of London had already set up a well-established, well-resourced unit that looked exclusively at climate change risks and how the insurance sector ought to approach the risks there. So we do have underdeveloped support systems in insurance and the financial sectors. We still find that main players in these sectors are not attuned to the risks and the new requirements. And then, of course, we have this question of what I describe as geopolitical entanglements. Who are our friends, who we decide are our friends, who are the friends of our friends, and who are the friends of our enemies at the geopolitical level. And those entanglements very often land us in trouble when it comes to presenting a common face and using a common voice at international negotiations. How have we been doing in the media? But I am of the view that climate change is not underreported in the Caribbean media. I think that the outcomes of climate change are very heavily reported in the Caribbean media. You will not probably see explicit mention of climate change, but you will recognize that there are climatic episodes that are reported in different ways in the media. But even in saying so, I think we need to be cautious not to cross-reference weather and climate too comfortably, because weather and climate are not the same. And those present here would know the difference, quite easily. And a weather event does not necessarily signify something that's symptomatic of a general climate condition. We need to understand the whole matter of climate variability versus climate change. I remember when I first became interested in this subject, the discussion really centered around climate variability. The fact that over a long period of time, you do have variances in terms of climate conditions, but long-term climate change that can have dramatic implications for all areas of human existence was pretty much was never really fully on the table until relatively recently on the part of our public policymakers. There are issues related to the probable or proven causes of the climate crisis and the climate change conditions. We need to be very clear on those, and over the next few days, we are going to explore some of them. Now, I got into a lot of trouble because I was the one when we worked with Steve and our other colleague on covering the climate crisis. I got into trouble with even some of my colleagues about use of the term climate crisis. I think, let's be clear, what we face in the Caribbean is a crisis, the climate crisis. And we can spend some time discussing and debating that if you want, but I think that it's going to be very difficult to convince any of either the experts or people who have been the subjects of the climate crisis throughout the Caribbean to convince us that what we're dealing with is nothing less than a crisis. For journalists, we need to recognize that it's cross-cutting in nature, and it includes issues of social justice. Now, when we speak about climate justice, this is very attractive. This kind of formulation is attractive to journalists because we spend virtually all our news agendas examining in our own way issues of climate, of social justice. of fairness, of equity, whether we're talking about the pandemic, and as I said in my opening remarks, there are commonalities between the pandemic conditions and what we have been facing with the climate crisis, because you have uneven impacts, and even the methods that we decide to employ to get out of the crisis have inequitable implications depending on who you are, where you are located. The other thing about the climate crisis is that the developments associated with crisis span news cycles. News cycles tend to be relatively short, so that something happens, a development occurs, and the news attention, the media attention on that development spans a certain amount of time, and then it kind of fades into the background. One of the issues with climate change and the climate crisis is that it spans a variety of news cycles, and it gains additional momentum virtually with each passing day and virtually with each development with which we are confronted. And that includes the issue of the pandemic and what we have been undergoing during the course of the past 2 years. What kind of attention have global media been paying to climate change or global warming? And those terms are, in my view, incorrectly used interchangeably. I think that global warming is a feature of climate change, but it does not summarize the entire picture. The experts here can correct me if they think I'm wrong. But what we find is that global media coverage, and unfortunately this study by the Media and Climate Change Observatory, which is at the University of Colorado in the United States, when they survey these different regions, they did not survey the Caribbean. And I think, though, that there are some patterns that would be common to us and the other areas of the world. What we find is that you have these huge spikes, and the first spike you see on that graph there would be around 2009, where I think that was the year for Copenhagen, Steve. 2009, and then of course you had the other spike in terms of media attention in 2021 when you had COP26 in Glasgow. Now, as I said before, coverage, explicit coverage on climate change does not signify coverage of the issues associated with climate change. So though you see these spikes, and you will see that it's a lower spike in 2021 than you saw in 2009, and that's because, of course, between 2019 and today, we are confronted with COVID-19, and significant media attention is devoted to the pandemic. But even so, you saw that there was a spike globally in terms of coverage of climate change as a discrete issue, vis-a-vis all of the other issues affecting us. So I think that you can take this as a general statement on media coverage, including media coverage in the Caribbean, of climate change as an explicit issue of media interest. And what you find is that following these COP meetings, there is a very steep downward movement, and everywhere in the world, where you speak about Africa, Asia, Europe, in the Pacific and elsewhere, there is this downward trend in terms of coverage, of explicit coverage of climate change. Though I would contend that in the Caribbean, climate change it continues to be covered, but not as climate change. When we have the extreme weather events expressing themselves as hurricanes and all of the difficulties with the recovery process, we are in effect covering a key feature of climate change as expressed in the Caribbean. Our own coverage really, though, as I said, it's episodic. So you'll find that when there's COP, when there are meetings of the world to discuss what next for climate change, there is a spike in interest. Media organizations devote resources, time and resources, and you see throughout the Caribbean, we see special programming and broadcast media and special attention being paid in the print media. So we do pay attention to these episodes. particularly when we have these high-profile meetings, or when we see emerging issues in the geopolitics that make reference to climate change and the actions associated with climate change. We also spend some time on the scientific disagreements, and there are scientific disagreements, but we need to be very careful about our weighting of opinions on this matter. For a long time, I remember, because I sort of entered this game a lot earlier, long before now, when there was a lot of discussion on the anthropogenic or the human-caused elements of climate change. We used to spend, I believe, a disproportionate amount of time engaging that discussion. And that was partly so because, you know, the balance in the scientific community between those who subscribe to the anthropogenic view as opposed to those who were of the belief that all of this was a natural cycle and would happen anyway, that gap has now closed considerably. So there is this notion in the practice of journalism that you need to bring balance. We need to be careful that in arriving at a notion of balance, that we are weighing equal or we are aware of the inequity, the inequality between the weight of one argument over the other. I mean, it's well established now, the anthropogenic causes, and 97%, it has been found in one study, of the global scientific community are in full agreement with this whole matter of whether the spikes that we've seen in temperatures and the trend in the direction of dramatic climate change are caused by, in part, by and largely by human interactions. You know, I came along even at a time when there was a lot of climate skepticism. So people who were saying, well, you know, this thing really is a lot of imagination, and there are still people who contend so. If you troll the internet, you go troll the internet for this kind of, you'll find that a lot of many people and even those with highfalutin authoritative sounding voices are still arguing that all of this thing really is overplayed. All of this is overemphasized. There's a lot of scientific hyperbole associated with this issue of climate change and the climate crisis. And we need to be wary of that. And if we have to decide, I think we should decide on the part of what the science is saying. There's also a lot of political conflict associated with this at the geopolitical level, but even at the domestic level. And then, of course, one of the main issues that guide media coverage of anything is what the money. What's the cost? What's the cost of all of this? What's the price? What is it going to cost us to ameliorate? How are we going to measure the impact of this when we use money? Then, of course, as I said, one of the main features of the climate crisis question in the Caribbean is the cross-cutting and pervasive presence of the climate crisis. The fact that it impinges on every single development sector that we cover, that are subject to beats in our media house, that are subject to the public discourse. So is this really the story of our time? I've often contended in my in writing in my newspaper column, which of course is opinion as opposed to news reporting, that the climate crisis poses a challenge to the long-term viability of our civilizations. That in the course of history, there are civilizations that have emerged, that have become pretty dominant and have now disappeared. If you take the long view of history, you will see that there are many instances in which you've had these civilizations that have arisen to heights of glory and to heights of achievement that now no longer exist. And if you break this down to the micro level, you look at the situation at some of our folks in the Pacific. And as I said at the opening of today's session, we did have a collaboration with our colleagues in the Pacific on climate change and other associated issues. They speak very routinely about the fact that there is territory that's going to be lost forever. And this is not unpopulated territory. This is not territory that does not mean anything to anybody. In some instances, they're talking about territory and land space that has been occupied by people, that you have had civilizations thriving, that you have had people living their daily lives, rearing families, engaging in productive output, that are now on the verge of disappearing completely. So I don't think that it is hyperbole to suggest that this thing poses an existential threat to our viability as civilizations here in the Caribbean. And this is not just activist hyperbole. I remember when we put out covering the climate crisis, a colleague of ours who resides overseas now said, why are you buying into all of this activist hyperbole, this overstatement? You know, you're going to lose the debate if you engage in this kind of language. We're not talking about a crisis, we're talking about a challenge. And, you know, so what? Well, this is not all activist hyperbole. These are facts, and we have scientists here who have spoken before me who have attested to that. We also pay attention to scientific confusion. And of course, I think on some finer points, there might be some disagreement among scientists. And again, as journalists, we need to be able to weigh the arguments, to examine what is accepted as fact, what is still being modeled, and what is still being proposed as the likely outcomes over a period of time. But what you will find if you look at this closely enough is that the leading scientists of our time globally all essentially agree on the same things. And even through all of this, you have a level of climate change skepticism that prevails. And I pay close attention to the social media activities of some of the key players in our region who have promoted a high level of climate change skepticism, who are basically asking, what is all this fuss about climate change? And what you find very closely associated with that during this period of the pandemic is a high level of COVID denial and COVID skepticism to start with. You can almost draw a column somewhere and put them in the same space. As we said in our 2005 climate change handbook, it's the whole issue of climate change is so multifaceted that they engage a huge variety of disciplines. And we have attempted in this series to bring together as many people from the various sectors. We have people who are going to look at this thing in terms of business. We have people who are looking at it in terms of science. I mean, we have people who are looking at it in terms of public policy. So it's multifaceted. It spans a full spectrum of public affairs. So whether as a journalist you're interested in the environment, and let's not make the mistake of believing that climate change is solely concerned with matters of environmental management. I noticed in one of our tweets earlier on, somebody raised the issue of air pollution. Air pollution is a very real environmental management issue. But the story of climate change really spans a huge variety of journalistic concerns. It's not only environment, it's health, economics and finance. In fact, it's hugely a question of economics and finance. Both Jimmy and Steve spoke about it. It's matter of education. Steve spoke about the issue of how do we prepare, how do we accumulate our resources, gather our resources in a way of bringing the best of that we have to offer to bear on this challenge of the climate crisis. broader development, community life, the fact that even within territories, we are unevenly impacted by the climatological conditions that are leading to difficulties on the coast, so that you will find that our fisher folk are reporting one thing, as opposed to people who are inland, who are perhaps engaged in agriculture and other economic activities that are hampered by the fact of changing climate conditions. Now, some words of caution, which is that, you know, we need, even as we need to treat and attend to the skepticism that's out there, and it does exist, even among people who have environmental management credentials that are otherwise impressive. We find that they tend to kind of throw the climate crisis on the back burner in exchange for greater attention for their environmental management issues. And it's valid and it's important that they lobby for their causes. But in the process, what happens many times is that you find that part of their messaging expresses a level of skepticism about the whole phenomenon of climate change and the climate crisis. We need to be aware of the fact as journalists that the skepticism is not monolithic, that is, you can't just throw all of them in one basket and done with that. I did speak about about making the column, but even as we need to do so, as a matter of caution, we need to bear in mind that it's not monolithic, that there are debates on the science and on the public policy approaches. You know, Steve spoke very eloquently on that. The public policy prescriptions that are being proposed by the international community and even by some of us are worthy of debate and discussion and interrogation and critical interrogation. The whole matter of the economics of climate, of managing the climate crisis is something that's subject to a wide variety of nuances and discussions and debates. And we need to be mindful of this fact, when as journalists we approach a question so that we capture the diversity. But even as we question the diversity of views and opinions on this, we need to know enough, to acquaint ourselves enough with the subject so that we do not add additional weight where it does not belong or take away value where it exists. So because we do have this saying, you know, it's an instinct, it's a knee-jerk reaction on the part of journalists to look for the other sides. But you need to have apples, you need to weigh apple, you have to be careful that when you're dealing with apples, you're not also throwing oranges in the mix. There is science, and Caribbean societies, we know that even our policymakers are not always heavy on science and data. You don't have a lot of data-driven decision-making. Unfortunately, people in government, for some reason, have cast aside the option of data-driven decision-making. What you have is a lot of use of intuition and a very quick resort to what we consider to be common sense. And many times we put the science apart and we say, well, you know, no matter, you know, Fletcher and Maximi and Southey and these guys, yes, they understand the science, but they don't understand that we have to deal with people and you have to keep people happy, and you have to make sure that the people who support you and who will put you back in office, we have to be sure that their interests are satisfied. So they resort to a kind of to employment of intuition and political common sense and all these things, and they cast aside the science. We need to be careful when we're framing stories, when we're examining these issues journalistically, that we understand what is at play many times. You know, science really provides us with the only empirical guidance that we have in terms of where we are and where we can expect to be. Because all of this is very much in fitting with what we describe as news values in the media industry. The non-journalists among us don't always get that, because not everything that happens is considered to be news by the news gatherers. Not every development is considered news. not all bits of information is considered as news. There's a sharp distinction. When Soini goes to produce her newscast on the weekend in Trinidad and Tobago, she has to make a sharp distinction between news and the mass of information that's coming her way, because not all information is news, though news automatically is information. What among the things we need to assess, for example, as working journalists, is what is the impact? What's the scale of the impact of a particular development? What's the nature of the impact? And what's the distribution? How many people does it affect? What sectors does this particular episode impact? That is an overwhelming consideration in terms of the news gathering process. We also look at some of the equity issues, so why has this occurred in this area and not the other? Why has this bit of public infrastructure failed here, where when you look at it just next to it, public infrastructure has held firm? There's a weather event, there's an earthquake or something. And so you do, in a sense, address the equity issues by looking at the impact and the way impact is distributed. We also seek out people and advice and information on the public policy responses and how do they relate to global actions. So these are ways of contextualizing stories so that you don't miss the core themes of the climate crisis. And then definitely you have geopolitical issues that need to be in, and we know them well. We see that with the realignments that are currently occurring globally, linked in part to the Ukraine-Russia crisis, but also linked to areas of conflict elsewhere in the world, the geopolitics relations with different countries based on different criteria. All over there, we need to weigh all of this, because opinion making and opinion leading on this issue is very much subject to geopolitics. Some of the immediate stories and the episodic things: flooding, water supply. When in our discussions with the Pacific colleagues a few weeks ago, one of the things that you have to realize is that water is one of the huge issues, climate change issues, that we have to contend with. And those of us in the Caribbean who live in not in water short or water scarce countries, but countries where natural water supplies are very high, will have very valid questions to ask about the distribution and the availability of potable water. There are issues related to physical discomfort. So you find that there's a discussion and there are stories that have been written. People have explored the issue of the fact that during the pandemic lockdowns, there were fewer vehicles on the road, and therefore the emissions that you would expect emerging from over this period, there was a recognizable decline in net emissions. But how was that offset by the fact that because we're generally dealing with warmer periods, the higher use of air conditioning throughout in our countries? And of course, we use the air conditioning, and we use these kinds of ways of addressing physical discomfort. So very real physical, practical experience of feeling warm, where you have to do your work at home, and in most homes would not be as prepared for spending long hours at a desk in front of a screen as with an office. The whole matter of physical discomfort is something that can't be dispelled. The management of the impacts. What do the politics say? Where is the money available? Then those are questions that can be asked not only nationally, but at the global level. What is our land use policy and management? The approaches in all our countries throughout the Caribbean, we have issues of land use policy and the management. In Trinidad and Tobago, there's a live story that's on the news agenda today about issues of land use policy and management and corruption associated with it. The incidents of squatting, the use of land by industry, agriculture, and the tourism sector. The impacts, the displacement of communities. The fact that the more we look at what's happening, if we have colleagues from Guyana now, so they would understand this whole question of the need for eventual migration of entire populations from one area to the next because of flooding episodes that are occurring not only in the coastline, on the coastline, but internally. In Suriname, you recently had very heavy flooding episodes. And so the whole matter of the displacement of people, the movement of populations from the coast to inland, from one point inland to the next, particularly in the bigger territories. The physical changes and habitat damage that are occurring. If you go to the deep south of Trinidad, of Ipcc, you will see very visible evidence of the physical changes in the ecology down there that are having an impact on livelihoods, that are having an impact on community life. And then you have the solid and liquid waste management issues that accompany most of our issues here. Sorry, so Kiran, can you make
No, go ahead, Wes. Somebody just came off mute. Go ahead.
Okay. Some of the issues and some of these things are not adequately covered, and as a result, in the public domain, there's a high level of misunderstanding of what's happening. But particularly if you look at the water issue, and in most of our countries now, where you're reporting these issues in terms of the availability of potable water, have we looked at some of the issue in terms of the toxins that are being found? There was a recent series of stories here in Trinidad and Tobago in terms of heavy metals and marine life off the west coast of Trinidad, the depletion of groundwater sources and contamination, changes in sediment loads. What's accounting for these changes in sediment loads in our water supplies? And I say this at every session where I deal with this particular issue, that the issue of flooding in our rainy season really is a dry season story. It's a dry season story in that during the dry season, observe what happens. Keep an eye on what happens in the dry season, because that's going to become your flooding story in the wet season. And then you have the overall visual impacts of what's happening. Now, all of this that I've said comes around to the question of justice, of social justice, and of climate justice, because all of these have uneven impacts on different communities, on different countries. And as a result, you have an inequitable distribution of the cost. So likewise, when you look at this thing globally, and Jimmy painted the picture, the global picture, what you really have unfolding is an inequitable distribution of the cost, of the relative cost of addressing the difficulties that have occurred as a result of the actions of a few. 25% of the world consuming 75 to 80% of our natural resources. What in terms of proportionality is the burden being borne by that 25% vis-a-vis the burden being borne by the rest of us? So there's an inequitable distribution of the cost, not only at the national level, but at the global level. And then there are imbalances in negotiation of the measures. And Jimmy painted the picture there. You go to the international meetings, and our countries, because of resources and the availability of people and expertise, our delegations tend to be much smaller and much less high-powered. The way forward, and I can't do this presentation without talking about what can we do. I think we need to pay attention to all of the issues that I've raised here. But we also, I think that people, the officialdom, and not only officialdom, meaning governments and their agencies, but even people within the scientific community, need to be much more forthcoming and open with their communication with the media in terms of relaying the information that they've gathered throughout this process. I think we are moving in the right direction, but we are not there yet. There's so much that's being left unsaid by people in the know. So we need a freer and improved flow of information between the scientific community, those in officialdom, and the media. They need to have greater awareness on the part of politicians. Climate change and the climate crisis is very frequently adopted as a partisan political issue. And therefore, so what you find is that with each election, there are political parties and politicians who move from one point of the spectrum to the other. They move from climate skepticism to climate advocacy. And so you can't have that. That's just nonsense. I think that journalists, we need to call them out on this. It happened during the course of the pandemic, but we'll talk about that at another time. And then, of course, we need to have better equipped communication professionals and journalists. And this is what this MIC effort is in part attempting to achieve. I think that if we put all of these things together, we will find ourselves in a much better place to address the burning issues of today. So we do have some time for questions.
Yes, so Wesley, I'll just go to what is in the chat right now. Christopher asked this, and I suspect it's not just for you, although I think you gave great perspectives on what we can do, not just in media, but perhaps in civil society as well. But Christopher asked, what can we do to better bring the capacity and competence in the region to bear on the action agenda? How do we bring the interdisciplinary capacity to bear on the agenda? Your thoughts?
I think that, yeah, that question, I know that's thrown in the direction of both Steve and Jimmy, but I think that one of the things that we can do coming out of the presentation I've just made is to see the media as a critical pillar in terms of formulating action to address the crisis. Too often the media are not viewed because of the fact that journalists sort of reject this notion of advocacy, of explicit advocacy. And I stand on that side of the spectrum as well. I think that good journalism will have an implicit developmental impact. And if there is good journalism, if there is competent interrogation of what the politicians are saying, what the scientists are saying, what the policymakers are saying, then you are going to have an impact that's going to be positive vis-a-vis the subject. But in terms of journalists being out there as overt advocates of one position or the other, I think that's going to compromise the work that we do.
Thank you. Steve, would you like to respond?
Sure. Wesley and I have had this discussion, in public and in private many times, in terms of the willingness of scientists and members of the scientific community to go on record, especially if it's going to be part of a 30-second soundbite. I think far too often we, as scientists, are wary of being misquoted, but what we consider to be misquoted by someone latching on to some attention-grabbing headline type response. But I think what we have been doing, when I say we now, I'm talking in the context of the ACM and the MIC, we have been building those kinds of bridges. I think there are more or less safe zones now where the members of the scientific community feel a lot freer, a lot easier to interact with the media, especially if we detect levels of interest from the media end. And the old adage that I know that Wesley is very proud of, that the media is not our, they're not our PR unit, and I think far too often as scientists, when we get into our little rabbit holes and there's an issue that we are very passionate about, we can't understand why the media isn't as passionate and doesn't want to take it and run with it. But I think we will look back at that slide that Wesley presented on what is newsworthy or what has news value, then we will see why we'd have to curb our enthusiasm most times, and not feel that every little thing that we are interested in would be newsworthy given the scale and the impact, etc. So that would be my approach. But as I said, you're preaching converted in this kind of setting, because
Yeah, well, let me just say the technical jargon used by scientists and environmentalists too sometimes doesn't make it easy. But I say that in an aside. But yes, I get the point. I thank you for that. I don't know if Dr. Fletcher wants to weigh in. Maybe he's.
Yeah, I guess to repeat what what Steve and Wesley have said, but also to add another dimension. You're not getting the kind of interdisciplinary collaboration that should happen, but at an even higher level, you're not getting the type of interagency collaboration that should happen. And I think that has to do with how we are framing the climate change problem. We're still framing the climate change problem as an environmental problem when it's not. Climate change is a problem that is social, it is economic, it is political, it is environmental, yes, it is cultural. It cuts across every single element of our lives. And unfortunately, the way our governments themselves, and I know that the prerogative of putting together a cabinet is the prime minister's, and I've sat in a cabinet as a cabinet secretary, and I've sat in a cabinet as a minister, and I've been able to appreciate some of the constraints that prime ministers put on themselves with the way they configure their cabinets that make it difficult for this type of interagency collaboration to take place. This gripe that we've had, this perennial gripe that we've had about the public service and the way it operates in silos, but that's because we configure our public service so that it operates in silos. Again, I'll tell a tale out of school. My prime minister once wanted to change the nomenclature. I was a Minister of Public Service, Sustainable Development, Energy, Science and Technology. And we had a chat and he said, Jimmy, I really would like to change this and put that you're also the Minister of Climate Change. I said, PM, no, please don't do that. If you do that, you're now making it look as if I have sole responsibility for climate change or climate resilience or whatever you want to call it. But every single member of your cabinet has responsibility for climate resilience. That, yeah, because it has its origins in an environmental it has its genesis in an environmental problem, people view it as the purview of the Minister of the Environment or the Minister responsible for natural resources, but it's not. And I think that's where we have to understand how broad the dimensions of climate change are. Until we do that, until you get tourism understanding that you can't have a tourism development plan if you don't look at the issues that climate change is causing for flooding, for water availability. Nobody wants to come to your hotel if they know that at certain points of the day there will be no water, or you tell them they can only bathe once a day. For food security, unless the Minister of Infrastructure understands the perils that climate change poses to public infrastructure, the Minister of Health understands the issues, the Minister of Justice understands the issues, then we'll continue to get this kind of siloed approach to climate change that will make it difficult for that interdisciplinary collaboration that we're looking for. It has to start at the top. And unfortunately, I have not really seen an administration that has dealt with climate change in the comprehensive, all-encompassing manner that it needs to be dealt with. They still see too much as an environmental problem when it's not. This is way past being an environmental problem.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Fletcher.
Jimmy, I think that perspective is fed very much by a lack of awareness on the part of people, because as I said, we tweeted earlier about this whole climate justice, and somebody countered by asking a matter that had to do with environmental management regarding air pollutants. So I think that what is really needed is a higher level of public awareness of these issues. And I think that's where it resides. And somebody posed a question about room for solutions journalism. The problem with solutions journalism, not everybody agrees what it is. People in the NGO sector in particular, and advocates, tend to believe that proposing a regime of solutions journalism means journalists coming on board with their particular cause. And there's a kind of expectation that we hold the placard up, well, metaphorically, of course, and that we subscribe to their actions and their intervention. Solutions journalism, from my interpretation of it, is one where you look at public issues and you interrogate them very critically, because you are in pursuit of a solution. So the end product of your journalism is a solution or a resolution, and therefore you critically interrogate all of the angles, bearing in mind, of course, what I spoke about in terms of the weighting of the information that's before you.
Thanks for that, Wesley. Thank you all very much for your feedback, your comments, questions, and to our presenters so far. We're moving right along with our final session this morning. I want to introduce you to Mr. Sean Southey and to thank him for being part of this. This is his first gig with us, so to speak. So Sean, it's a pleasure having you here. And just so our participants know a little bit about you, you have over 30 years of experience in the international development and communications field with a multi-sectoral background. And you started your career with 5 years in the Canadian Ministry of Environment, followed by 12 years working with the UNDP's environmental team. Sean's NGO experience was enriched through work with ICLEI, and I hope you all know what that is. For those of you who don't know the acronym, International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, and 10 years as president of IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, through the NGO member PCI Media. Sean is now co-founder and president of Zamia Media, and in the past decade, he has led the development of over 80 campaigns worldwide, won over 100 awards for impactful campaigns, and has literally reached billions of people with life and planet-saving information. It is really, really good to have you, Sean, because I think you're a fellow communicator. You communicate the messages a little bit differently, but I think at the end of the day, it's a shared vision, mission, and a purpose. So welcome, and I hand over to you.
Thank you, Kiran. Let me just put on my screen. It's a delight to join you today. Never again am I going to send you a big formal introduction like that, because we're in the Caribbean here and I feel part of the Caribbean community, even though I wasn't born there. I'm a Canadian South African. I've spent a long time in this work. I technically started as an economist, and now I'm a communicator. So the lesson for me in that is that anyone can be a communicator if we think about it. And if there's one thing we know from this morning and the wonderful work of, I hope I can call you Jimmy, because everyone else is, Jimmy and Steve and Wesley, is that this work is complicated. It's not easy. And most scientists and public policy people do a terrible job presenting it. And Jimmy and Steve are amazing at presenting this work, and it's still complicated. So I think it's really useful for us to reflect on the importance role you play as intermediaries between science and policy and the public. So when I was asked by Kiran and Wesley to speak on the issue of responsibility, and I'm going to focus on the responsibility piece, it was a real honor and delight. I am chair of IUCN's Commission on Education and Communication. That's an elected post. I've been doing it for 6 years, and it really looks at that base of communicating the challenges of climate change. And the 1,500 members of IUCN, I've just created a new commission, I'm glad to say, and Steve will be happy. It's the Climate Crisis Commission. It's not a climate change commission, and it truly is a climate crisis. I have put in the chat box how you can become a member of the commission I work with. It's right there. It's a network of 2,000 people who care about communication. And you as journalists are the front line of this work. Now, I am super lucky because I got to follow 3 really insightful, deep conversations. So it allows me to not tell you what climate change is, because you know that now, but to really go to the substance of my discussion with you, which is responsibility. But it's important to just realize how complicated this is, like Wesley said, and like Jimmy said. This affects all aspects of life. It is changing the world as we know it. It is happening. You know, the critics can be out there, the skeptics can be out there, But the science is definitive. The trends are definitive, and they are impacting. One of the amazing things about being able to travel for a living is I meet farmers in Guyana and farmers in Ghana and farmers in Vietnam. And each of them say it is real. It's real to us. So I don't want to debate that or go into that, but to understand those impacts, we're talking about damage. We're talking about people being hurt. And as Jimmy said, there's a whole complex mechanism inside the UNFCCC and the science community on codifying damage, trying to allocate damage, and damage needs to be fixed. And there are formal mechanisms that have been put in place by the Conference of the Parties on the Climate Change Commission that do, in theory, put mechanisms in place to offset these damages. And they aim to increase knowledge, they aim to increase coordination, and they aim to increase action. But as Jimmy said, they're not doing it. It's not sufficient. So I want to take a deeper look. You live in the Caribbean. You live in a paradise on earth. But let's be clear, your damages from climate change are impacting your oceans and they're impacting your lands. Acidification of the water, changes in coral reef, siltation, all of the problems outlined, they are your reality. But really, it's affecting you as people. And I love the Caribbean because there's an energy and there's a passion and there's a spark. The fact that you were there this morning before the meeting started. It was the first meeting I had been on in Zoom that started before the official time. That speaks to your passion and your energy. So when we look at this work, climate change, and we look at damages, we have to ask ourselves, if there are damages, someone must be responsible. So take a second to reflect. And if you can, please just put in the chat box who you think is responsible for the damages. Who do you think is responsible for this damage? Amy says everybody. Lisa says all of us. Everyone, but not equally. I like Lisa's insight. There's agreement. Now, this is really humans, people. This is critical to the role of a journalist, because when we look at climate change and responsibility, we have to look from two sides for me, from the responsibility perspective. We have to look at who caused it, but we also need to look at who can fix it. And as journalists, your job is to help people fix by helping people understand, as Wesley pointed out. So I want to go a little deeper. And the science agrees. Everyone is responsible and everyone can help fix it. Now that seems bold, big, that everyone can help fix it. But so I think it's important to think through a little bit the different segments of society. Government. Let's start with government. And I love the eloquence and the thoughtfulness of Jimmy's presentation on the role of the Caribbean in the UNFCCC process, the Climate Change Convention process. And I love this analysis and the role of the Caribbean in this work, because if we look at the science of governance, the work of governance, there's no question governments are responsible for protection of the environment. It is their role. They set the policy environment, they set the rules, they set the engagement strategies for the public, and they set the engagement strategies for business. So at the end of the day, government has an incredibly important role in fixing this problem. But the Caribbean is interesting. A lot of the work we look at in the legal framework of responsibility in government looks more from a developing country perspective of what is the damages that governments need to pay. and that body of work. And the Caribbean, frankly, is, I'm sorry, there's a whole test of legal responsibility, just so you know. There is a very deep body of literature and work that allows you to legally test responsibility, allocate responsibility, and in theory, get money out of groups when a cause is being true with real causation and not sufficient due diligence. These are all true facts. But if you look at the nations that have caused the problem, they're not the Caribbean. So the role of government in the Caribbean, the responsibility of government is not to necessarily radically change the production and infrastructure systems. It's that awareness building, that trigger, that advocacy work to protect your nations and to protect your people. The private sector is clearly very, very important, and we can have two worlds: a world where the private sector is a friend and the world where the private sector is not. And if we look at the contributions to climate change from the different industrial sectors, you know, they're all on the screen. We have industry, transport, forests, energy. These are the big major sections, okay? Each of these, the private sector can do a good job or a bad job. You can have sustainable forestry or not sustainable forestry. You can have energy provided by photovoltaics, or you can have energy provided by fossil fuels. Your buses, which government sets the rules and private sector supplies, can be electric buses or they can be gas buses. So there is an incredible role for the private sector, and therefore there's a responsibility. It's interesting to note that we're beginning to see jurisprudence and work that is actually people charging the private sector and getting funding when they have hurt the world and their communities on climate change. Interesting enough, a lot of that work is driven by local government as well as the NGO sector. I'm a big fan of the role of local government in this work. But you're, as intermediaries, as journalists, you can help be the bridge that helps the private sector realize there are solutions. And Wesley spoke of solutions journalism. And for me, solutions journalism is when you help reveal and surface a way a business can work and encourage them and celebrate them to do so, so they shift the way they operate in favor of a more climate positive environment. But I'm all about the people, and we can't forget the people. And really, we can't forget the power of the people. It's critical that we recognize that this work is driven by the thoughts and minds of people. They're the ones who own and run and work in businesses. They're the ones who elect your governments and therefore set the policy regime and the legislation that affects your world. And you are the ones that reach the people every day. On radio, on social media, on TV, in print journalism, you are the bridge that can empower the people to fix the world. And you can make it easy. People make waste. People can recycle. People drive. They can look at their fuel supply. They can look at their offsets. They can look at the way they operate their homes. We each have what's called a carbon footprint. That's why that diagram is a footprint, and you can help the public realize how they can make their footprint smaller. What we want is a small carbon footprint, so we help the planet by each of us individually, day by day, reducing the negative impacts on climate change. But I want to ask you now a question. Back to the chat. So what is your responsibility as a journalist? If everyone is responsible, as you all said, what is your responsibility? I want to see some answers in the chat box, please. Lisa, you're always quick. Come on. Bennett, Brian. Thank you, Lisa. I knew you'd do it. Fair, clear, concise information. Sharing of information for better decision making. Excellent. 2 more. Providing experts. But that's Lisa twice, so we're not going to count it. Oh, here we go. Educate the public, making fair. Affect journalism, influence, responsible action. All of these are right. As the bridge people, you can do all of these things. And you're doing it already. And you should be celebrated. You're doing it when you report on severe weather events. We know that severe weather events are particularly prevalent in the Caribbean. They are escalating and they're real. Jimmy showed a picture of Dennery at the beginning in his presentation. And I stayed in Dennery in January to work with PAHO and the St. Lucian Ministry of Health on COVID hesitancy. Dennery, my dear colleague, friend, brother, Aline Regis, who many of you know, lives in Dennery. So I have this affection for Dennery. And Dennery suffers every time there's a big landslide from real problems. This is not Dennery, but each of you know that these images are real. That whether it's Grenada or Barbados or Haiti, you're suffering from complex weather events and you should report it. But for me, your responsibility, as you say in the chat, is also the climate solution space, making it real. And if I'm not mistaken, that's St. Lucia, 90% sure. And again, as people say, just Christopher just said it, simplifying complexity. So make it easy for people. Here is 10 easy things that people can do to help climate change. The way you transport yourself, the way you stock your home, the food you eat, the way you vote. All of these things are gifts to the planet that you can be the bridge for. And you can do it many ways. There's hundreds of these facts available. A 5-minute Google will give you access to these. Plus, the entire family of journalists have this material, and people like Steve and Jimmy and Wesley and Kiran are all eager to share it. And that's why this network of MIC is so powerful. And I want to go back to this simple entry point of something like mangroves. Mangroves are a ubiquitous, beautiful symbol of the Caribbean, and yet they are one of the anchor points of sustainable development in the Caribbean. So remember that you can make it real. You can make it touching everyone's lives. I also believe that you have a responsibility to celebrate the heroes. And yes, we have Greta's, but I'm actually thinking in the Caribbean, who cares about Greta? You have heroes. And for me, Jimmy is a hero. And that entire team of Oasis and CARICOM and GLISPA and the governments that advocated the 1.5 to stay alive, if there's one set of heroes in the international negotiation, it's the Caribbean and the islands that followed in advocating for climate change. So I agree with Jimmy. Never underestimate your impact. Never underestimate your impact. Your heroes are the one Jimmy mentioned and the people on this call who are making a difference. That's the stories to tell. It became really clear for me too, really clear, when I was doing this work on COVID hesitancy in St. Lucia, and I was back 2 or 3 times in the fall. Be aware of language. Meet your audience where they are, not where you want them to be. And there was a time when all of the COVID messaging was coming out in English or French or Spanish, but it wasn't coming out in Creole. And it wasn't coming out in the local language. If you want to touch people, touch them through the linguistic nuances that they live and breathe. That's what you can do as journalists. Diversify, share the message multiple ways, make it simple, make it actionable, make it meaningful, make it real. I want to just remind you about one thing that is true in the world, and that's climate anxiety. And we may not all feel it equally, but there's an incredibly growing group of people, particularly young people, who feel climate anxiety. And that's a heaviness, it's a weight, it's a fear. And when we talk about an existential crisis, it should be a fear. We could not be here in 100 years. That's a reason to be anxious. But as journalists, we have to balance this. We have to share these two sides. We have to be making people aware of the problem, but guiding them to act responsibly. Back to this issue of responsible behavior. I'm going to close with, because I don't want to end on anxiety. I think that's not the place we want to end a talk. And so I'm going to end with a quote from a dear friend and colleague of mine, Achim Steiner. We have a responsibility to first understand how climate change impacts all people of the world. That's the first part of the responsibility you identified. Help people understand. Then the second part of the quote, then we must consider the individual and collective choices and actions that move us towards a sustainable future. That's the acting. And that for me is the two parts of this responsibility. The part that informs people, educates people, gets people excited and caring, and helps them act responsibly. With that, I close and thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Before we get into the questions from the chat, there's something I really wanted to ask you. When we talk about who's responsible, okay, agreed, we're all responsible. I think that's a given. And the UNFCCC came to the conclusion that we're all responsible, but not equally so, as Lisa so correctly mentioned. And that there's collective but varied responsibility, which is a term that is a useful term if you want to hide, literally, because I mean, if we're all responsible, then we should all be doing something. I wanted to share this discovery with you and to see what your reaction is. Apparently there's a village in Peru threatened by a dam bursting under glacial action, and they have taken the German company, coal mining company, to court, and it's in the final stages of the proceedings, but they're using attributive science. In other words, they know that that German company is responsible for, let's say, 0.005% of all global emissions. So they're asking for compensation to the tune of 0.005% of whatever it's going to cost to remove the dam. What are your thoughts on that? And how do you see that playing into the whole concept of responsibility for climate change and for climate impacts?
I mean, I think the legal field is progressing really powerfully on this front. And IUCN has a commission on environmental law, and I talked to the chair before coming to this talk and got her to share with me 5 or 6 papers that I'd be delighted to share with you, Wesley, and the group, because we don't all necessarily love lawyers, but lawyers are so important in the system because lawyers are the ones who bring damages forward in a way that make people have to respond. Journalists never have an authority to say you must do. But lawyers inside a legal system can make people do. And as this attribution science is getting stronger and stronger, so we're getting better at allocating damages and better at pointing at who's done, combined with a populace and a community that are supportive of this, because frankly, the people are needed for laws to work. We will see more and more and more of this. And frankly, as climate change impacts get worse, and they will, we're going to see these fields coming up more and more. And as the jurisprudence comes together, the legal backbone of this work, it'll be easier for other people in other communities to do the same. So we should celebrate those Peruvians as frontline advocates.
Yeah. Thank you. Kiran, I didn't want to necessarily steal what you were going to ask. Sorry.
No, Sean, I was just wondering, because you've had all of this experience in many, many countries throughout the world, if you had to look at messaging from the Caribbean, what do you think you would try to zero in on?
So I believe, like Wesley, that climate change in the world, but particularly in the Caribbean, is an awareness of it is polarized, just like COVID. Okay, and we have two deep communities, and looking deeply at the COVID situation, and I've done Callaloo, a long-running soap opera on climate change in the Caribbean, and This Is Who We Are with TNC and GIZ in 7 or 8 countries of the Caribbean on climate and marine. The converted are converted, and the not converted are not converted. And you have a particular media environment right now where when a message comes in on social media, by the end of the day, everyone in that country knows it. And they're not always the right messages. And so there's this problem where the wrong messages comes forward, the community sort of believes it, it gets distributed really fast, and government is frankly not equipped to respond quick enough. It's not the way government is set up. So I think we need to have a media regime where when bad politics bad messaging comes up on climate change, the responsible journalists are there to question it immediately, quickly. There's a huge disconnect. But I also believe, and I love this campaign we did, This Is Who We Are. And I thought of closing with a music video because the world needs more great music videos from the Caribbean. But the very culture of the Caribbean is intertwined with oceans and land, and therefore with climate change. So it's about getting everyone to understand that this is a reality for them.
Thanks for that, Sean.
Sean, if I may, before we address some of the questions in the chat, what do you think of the suggestion, and it's a little more than a suggestion, it's something I wrote a little while ago, that we are faced with a situation where some individuals, known and unknown, dug a pit. They may not have dug it with the intention of having us fall into it, but we are fallen into it. And as part of their responsibility, as part of owning up to the responsibility of having an open pit into which we have fallen, they see enough justification and enough comfort in throwing us a rope ladder. Knowing full well that a rope ladder is useless unless it's firmly placed on top, and throwing us a rope ladder may be symbolic and it may have good press, but it really doesn't help us, because until they take the responsibility of fixing that rope ladder to the surface so that we can climb out, it's really, they're just really going through the motions. And that's how I see some of the carbon credit type schemes going. But what would be your thoughts on the approach of the global north to throwing us what appears to be assistance, but it's really a rope ladder that they're throwing into a pit that we didn't create and that we need to get out of?
To use another analogy, I think we're putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. And we continue to do it. I think we are failing radically to meet this challenge. And the fact that in every 4 or 5 years, the situation gets worse, and the fact that the science is showing the impacts are even greater than the predicted bad models means you're right. We are building a bigger and bigger pit. And frankly, the intergovernmental process is failing. I agree with Jimmy on that. It's not living up to what the science is saying. What can we each do about it? We sometimes with messaging, we think what is distanced and doomed is not something to take on. So it's hard because we don't have a direct connection to it. So as journalists, our job is to make it less distant, to make it less doomed. I do think the Caribbean has a particular role. I mean, you can call it the canary in the coal mine role, but that's not how I see it. It's not a nice image in my mind. I like to see you as the champions who are helping the world understand that this problem is real, but it's also solvable. So I believe to speak up is the number one opportunity for the Caribbean, because frankly, the global north is not delivering on the magnitude of the problem.
Thank you.
I don't know how to make it better, except through the power of voice and the power of voting and the power of people.
Yeah. No, I would just love if, maybe when Jimmy comes back on, if we can have, proper pronouncements from the donors and the other, purveyors of good news and solace, that when they do throw us a rope ladder, we identify it as that and said, look, this is all good and well, looks good for the photo op, but until we have something that's firmly rooted, firmly grounded at ground level, this rope ladder makes absolutely no sense. And that's how I see some of the assistance that we've been getting as means of adapting and even on occasion mitigating. So I don't know, Jimmy, if you want to, if you agree with the analogy or if you want to add in that respect.
Yeah, I think there are a few things, Steve. First of all, we have been very adamant as small island developing states and even the wider community of climate vulnerable countries, that the assistance we get for adaptation cannot be loan funding. It cannot be, because you see, you're actually asking us to borrow money to respond to a problem that we did not cause. So you benefiting from it. We're borrowing money from you. Doesn't matter whether it's a 0.5% or 1% interest rate. We're borrowing money from you to respond to a problem that you caused. So we've been very adamant that the funding that's provided for adaptation, and particularly for loss and damage, has to be grant funding. I mean, in some instances, we can consider highly concessional funding, but by and large, it has to be grant funding. Where the loan funds can come in, we've said, for mitigation, because mitigation, particularly the cost of electricity in all of our countries, well, all with the exception of Trinidad and Tobago, the cost of electricity is high in all of our countries. So in the case of St. Lucia, you're paying between 35 and 41 US cents per kilowatt hour. So anything you do with respect to transitioning away from the use of fossil fuels and going towards wind, solar, geothermal, in the long run, you will be saving money. So we can borrow money for mitigation. We can borrow money for transitioning our energy system, be it electricity or transport system, away from fossil fuels, because we know there's a very short payback period on whatever loans we take, and in the long run, we will benefit. But when it comes to adaptation, we will not borrow money. You have to make loan funds available to us. However, what they've very cleverly done is where initially the conversation about climate financing, we thought was always going to be a conversation about public financing. So how the governments, the respective governments, those that have caused the problem, would put funding into the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the GEF, whatever. Now the conversation is shifting. So climate finance is now defined as private funds also. What funds the private sector is going to put in, what monies the banks will make available to us, particularly the multilateral development banks. And that changes the whole equation, because it means now, as you said, you're putting us in an even deeper hole, because we now have to borrow money. And many of our countries, let's not forget, the limited fiscal space that many of our countries are suffering from right now is as a result of them having to borrow money to respond to hurricanes, storms, heavy winds. A lot of the borrowing we've done has been to respond to extreme weather events. So now you're telling us that we have to go and borrow more money, where our debt to GDP ratios in many of our countries are already alarmingly high, to respond to a problem that you're causing and you're continuing to cause. That cannot be right. So yes, but again, the developed countries do not want to have a conversation at all. And I'm going to tell you at all about liability and compensation. When we were negotiating the Paris Agreement, the delegates from the UK, I remember Amber Rudd at the time, well, she later became Home Secretary, but at the time, Amber Rudd was the Minister of the Environment with responsibility for climate change in the UK. Amber having a sidebar with me at the pre-COP in Paris, that was sometime November, and Amber said to me, you know, I appreciate what you're trying to do with loss and damage, but just understand that if there's any language about liability and compensation in any discussion on loss and damage, the UK and the rest of the EU will not support it. Todd Stern, who was the US's climate envoy and who I developed a really good relationship with, Todd made it very clear to me that the US government would not entertain any language on liability and compensation. And to this day, that remains the sticking point, that while they will subtly push back against some of the scientific reports that speak of the historical responsibility for climate change, where they absolutely draw the line is saying that they are liable for that damage, and they therefore, because of that liability, must compensate us with some type of financial or other support. And that, I think, is a hurdle we have to get past. And that's why I think this whole climate justice argument has to be expanded.
And I think, yes, Christopher raised an issue in the chat about reparation. There's a stock response from these countries, and they cover a variety of things. But I like Steve's allusion to the situation in the Peruvian community, because the question of proportionality comes into being, and responsible, capital R responsibility, not necessarily the common R responsibility of sound environmental management on the part of our societies and our people. That goes without saying. But the capital R responsibility for all of this, I'm not surprised that you would get that kind of feedback from the developed countries, because from reparations for slavery come down. That's a fact. Our challenge is, what next? So what else? What do we come with? Because we can't pick up the tab ourselves. There's no way. No matter what the nationally determined contributions we come up with, which are in a sense, in the global sense, not significant. In the global, they're not significant. It's good. It makes good politics. You can come back home and say, okay, we have these NDCs and we commit to do that, and electric vehicles and so on. But that's just a drop in the ocean.
Well, you saw the slide that I put out on the contribution of Caribbean countries to global greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, even if I'm not saying we do, but even if we double or triple our emissions, we're not going to make any difference to that inventory of global greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, we need to transition to a low carbon economy because it makes sense for us economically. Because if we can reduce, particularly in these times, you're seeing what this Russia-Ukraine war is doing to fuel prices. If we could insulate ourselves from the volatility in the global oil market, yes. And it also helps us to speak with a level of moral authority where we can see that a country like St. Lucia contributes 0.001% of global greenhouse gases, yet we're making a commitment to reduce our carbon footprint by 35% by the year 2030. What are you doing? You know, but you're right, these NDCs where they focus on mitigation, really, they don't matter much. NDCs for us is what money are you going to give us so that we can adapt to climate change? That's where the NDC discussion should be.
And even among ourselves, there's inequality, because what do we do with Guyana, which is emerging as an energy giant globally? Trinidad and Tobago, a long time in the business, and Suriname, which is emerging. It's a different dynamic that would apply to us.
Yeah.
No, but Sean, I don't want to necessarily let you off the hook. You know, I want to hear, you know, some of your comments about how we collectively, you know, bringing all these disciplines together, can impact this big R responsibility, you know, which was your responsibility for this session. You know, what else do you see us doing?
mean, I would not underestimate for a moment the power you play through the 1.5 movement and being the reinforcers and the watchdogs and the responsibility for understanding what not staying at 1.5 means and using that as leverage to discuss financial flows, the way financial flows happen. I would be looking at deepening the teams that support Jimmy and others in situ, in country, so that you have, journalists know what's going on, communicating what's going on. The 1.5 was fascinating because it was super clear, 1.5. And let's be clear, these aren't really scientific targets in a way. They're nomadic targets. They're plays that they take complex issues and make them understandable to the public. Okay, so they're not, America is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, climate change problem. They don't even use centigrade; they use Fahrenheit. So 1.5 doesn't even speak to them in theory, but it does. So you gave a huge gift to the world by putting a big audacious goal on the table. Now, and it worked because your journalists aligned with your NGO sector, aligned with your government, and created probably the most successful campaign we've seen in the environment sector in the last 15 years, the 1.5 movement. I think it was that powerful and that transformative. Leverage that, build on that. And because you have that role and that brand and that ability, that positioning, use it to continue doing what you're doing. But that means making sure that the teams are big enough to do the work, that the journalists are lined up behind it. And I guess I'm saying, do what you're doing it, but do it even louder.
And just to add to what Sean is saying, 1.5 is a major victory for small island developing states. Going into Paris, nobody was talking 1.5. The discussion was only about 2 degrees Celsius. Now, I remember the first time I heard, I think it was Bernie Sanders reference 1.5 in a debate, in a political debate. I was over the moon. I said, wow, somebody other than the SIDS is talking 1.5. Now, nobody speaks 2 degrees Celsius anymore. Everybody acknowledges 1.5 as the long-term temperature goal. Unfortunately, we're very close to 1.5. And I think that's why, as Sean is saying, we must really hammer 1.5 as the limit, that nothing we do from this point onwards can put that limit in peril. I think that gives us an anchor that we can craft all our conversations, all our communications around, because 1.5 is a victory for small island developing states. The same way anything above 1.5 is a death sentence for small island developing states. So I agree with that, Sean, 100%. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, everyone, I want to thank, on behalf of Media Institute of the Caribbean, our board of directors and our advisory board, Mr. Sean Southey, for being here and doing this with us. Sean, I think we may be seeing a lot more of you, but I think we knew that from the first conversation we had. But thank you so much for your insight and sharing your learnings and experiences. Dr. Fletcher, I want to thank you sincerely. I think that the journalists here were thrilled to have you on. So please expect a follow-up phone call from MIC, because I think I'm going to have to nab you and interview you specifically on this topic for the benefit of everyone here. Steve, thank you as always, who helped develop the curriculum actually for this series. And Wesley, thank you. To all of you here, I think we are off to a very good start with where this discussion has to go. We knew that when we were picking up this initiative, it was not going to be an easy one because there is just so much to say and so little time. Someone did ask about getting students involved. We always support working with students. It's part of our course-related initiatives. So please feel free to send the link to students to register. I think that the session on Thursday coming is going to be very, very interesting for them. It talks about intergenerational impacts. And we will also have Dr. Ulrich Trotz with us on that day. And then the next day that I think is very important for the young people will be next week, Thursday as well. So if they don't come to the one next Tuesday, they don't miss out as much, but definitely we're going to have the youth ambassadors and we're going to have young people speak on the topic, and they will see how they can become much more involved. So to all of you, thank you again for taking your time to be here with us. And as I said, working collaboratively, cooperatively, together as one voice, many voices coming together, we will create that bridge. And I know that we will have success. So to you all, stay safe and have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you.